Hello, I'm Saifedean Ammous. Welcome to the Bitcoin Standard Podcast, bringing you seminars from Saifedean.com, my online learning and publishing platform where you can be the first to read my work and take my online courses on Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Members can read the draft of my next book, The Fiat Standard, in full, and also receive chapters from my forthcoming textbook, Principles of Economics, as they are written. By joining Saifedean.com, you can also join our regular seminars which you hear on this podcast. The Bitcoin Standard Podcast is brought to you by BitMEX Spot, the brand new spot exchange from BitMEX. You've probably heard of BitMEX, one of the oldest large Bitcoin companies, who played a leading role in helping Bitcoin emerge victorious from the hard fork wars of 2017. Their derivatives trading platform has stood the test of time and set the standard for reliability and performance for Bitcoin companies. BitMEX is now bringing that reliability to its spot exchange, and it is celebrating the launch of BitMEX Spot with a total of $1 million in prizes and a first prize of $500,000. Sign up on bitmex.com/Saifedean to begin buying Bitcoin and get a chance of winning. Coinbits. Coinbits is a great way to introduce your pre-coiner friends and family to Bitcoin. Get them set up in under a minute and help kickstart their journey by turning everyday spare change into Bitcoin. This Bitcoin-only app takes the uncertainty and fear out of Bitcoin saving by rounding up debit and credit card purchases to the nearest dollar, then using the difference to buy Bitcoin. Set it, forget it, and let the app automatically tax your high-time preference spending by saving the hardest money ever. Want to save in Bitcoin faster? Customers can multiply their roundups up to 10x or adjust their savings frequency for weekly or daily Bitcoin stacking. Coinbits is built on a sound, tried and true dollar cost averaging strategy that turns Bitcoin's volatility in your favor. Once you've gotten a private wallet set up, Coinbits encourages you to withdraw your Bitcoin to your own private wallet and embrace the Bitcoin standard way of life. Start stacking on coinbitsapp.com and save your time and energy in the soundest money ever. Hello, welcome to another episode of the Bitcoin Standard Podcast. Today's seminar guest is Dr. Benjamin Bikman. Dr. Benjamin Bikman is a best-selling author and professor at Brigham Young University. He specializes in the role that insulin and nutrient metabolism play in regulating obesity, diabetes, and dementia. He earned his PhD in bioenergetics and was a postdoctoral fellow in metabolic disorders at Duke National University of Singapore. And he joins us today for a discussion on the topic of why we get sick, which is also the title of his best-selling book, which has been translated to, what is it now, 20, I think, languages?
Well, no, not quite. About halfway there. Yeah, but some relevant ones.
Yes. So thank you for joining us, Ben.
Oh, my pleasure, Saifedean. Thanks so much to you and the team for getting me on.
It's great to be chatting to you. I think your perspective on disease in your book is a very interesting and very refreshing one. And it's what I like about it is that it gets to the heart of the matter in a very practical way, in a sense of, how can you actually not get sick, rather than getting lost in academic debates and academic pissing contests, which can be too often the case in academia. So it's good to keep your eye on the prize on what matters. And I think this is what your book does. So let's get right to it. Why do we get sick?
Yeah. Thanks again. I actually like the way you framed this because we both, you and I think, share a common disdain for academia. And it's ironic a little maybe for me. I don't mean for it to sound ungrateful because I am a professor at a university currently. And I am so mindful of the nonsense that happens at universities. And so it was very much an interest of mine to take the knowledge that we scientists are gaining and break through the barrier of, the traditional model for us would be that we publish a paper in a peer-reviewed journal and no one ever reads it except a handful of other scientists. And thus is largely irrelevant to actually improving someone's life. I really wanted to circumvent that feudal cycle of academia and take relevant information right to people. So the question, why do we get sick? I naturally was looking at this question through my lens, and my training is in kind of metabolic biochemistry and physiology. And I couldn't help but see there was one common foundation to virtually every non-communicable chronic disease. So the chronic diseases that you get that have nothing to do with, infection. And, this is like cancers and heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, kidney disease, et cetera. And of course, each of these problems have unique inputs. I would want everyone to know that each of these problems do have unique origins, but they all have one common origin, and that is insulin resistance. It is this disorder that people, I mean, the reason I didn't call my book, What is Insulin Resistance and Why Does It Matter, is because I knew no one would buy it. They would look at the title and they would say, well, I'm not a diabetic. I don't need to read that. They just see insulin and they think diabetes. But insulin is an absolute life-giving hormone. It is essential. You have to have it. And if you don't, like untreated type 1 diabetes, you will die in short order. So this is an essential hormone that literally impacts every cell of the body. There's no exception to this. I don't use the term literally too liberally like the kids do these days. It literally affects every cell in the body. And it dictates the theme of what insulin does is it tells a cell what to do with the energy that it has. So whatever the nutrient or the caloric energy is that's in the system, that's coming in the system, or it's already stored, insulin will tell the cell what to do with it. And thus, it's pretty essential. Every cell needs energy. Nevertheless, insulin resistance is a disorder, to define it now explicitly. It's really a coin with two sides, or a disorder with two facets that must come together. You cannot have one side of the coin without the other. The first part of this definition of what insulin resistance is that insulin as a hormone isn't working as well as it used to. That evokes the kind of resistance part of it, that some cells aren't responding very well. But then the second part of it is very often overlooked, but equally essential to understand why it's so pathogenic, why insulin resistance is such a problem. And that is that insulin levels are chronically elevated, a condition called hyperinsulinemia. So you have the two of these together. Insulin isn't working correctly, and blood insulin levels are elevated. And both of those together constitute the background for so many of these chronic disorders or diseases. For example, and then I can finish the answer because I'm getting long-winded, but let's take the two most common forms of infertility. In women, the most common form of infertility is a disorder called polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. And this is a disorder of too much insulin. And that is why if a woman has PCOS, she absolutely has insulin resistance. But not because the insulin isn't working well, but because it's too high. And when insulin levels get too high in a woman, it actually inhibits the ovary's ability to create normal balances of sex hormones. She can't make estrogens as well as she could before, and she fails to ovulate, and now she has polycystic ovary syndrome. But in a man, the most common infertility is erectile dysfunction. And that's a problem of the insulin not working well, not the elevated insulin per se, but again, you still have both of those things always happening together. But in his case, for normal erectile function, you have to have a significant vasodilation, or the blood vessels have to dilate and alter blood flow accordingly. But when the blood vessels become resistant to insulin's effects, insulin, which normally is providing that dilation effect, can't induce dilation as well, and the blood vessels stay constricted, and the constricted blood vessels means erectile dysfunction. So that's it's an interesting dichotomy, looking at the two forms of infertility in women and men, where each of them is caused by a different aspect of insulin resistance.
Yeah, and it's just something that continues to come up with all kinds of medical conditions. It's astonishing, even as a non-doctor. I would say probably, especially as a non-doctor, it just keeps coming up. You hear about a certain condition, or somebody who gets sick in something with something, and you read more about it, you hear them talk about it, and this always comes up. There's always this mention of blood sugar levels, insulin levels, insulin resistance. It's implicated in so many things. What I find fascinating, and I'd like to kind of switch back and forth between the academic topic itself and the way that academics study it, because that's another focus of my work, which I discuss in the Fiat Standard, of just how academia is essentially massively compromised, and a giant attack on your ability to understand the world and reason properly. It's not just that they're doing innocuous nonsense that nobody cares about. It's that they're actively preventing people from understanding what the problem is, because even as a non-specialist, you see this thing come up everywhere. And then if you do one day in your life try and say, hey, let me just take a look at this, let me see if I can bring my blood sugars down for a while and see what I can do and see what effect it has on me, And then all these different kinds of health problems that you thought were just a normal part of growing up disappear, and you're back to being healthy and powerful and strong in many ways. And so you would imagine, you'd imagine doctors would be out there shouting this from the rooftops, telling everybody to, hey, focus on this little thing called insulin, your blood sugar, try and keep that down. If you are overweight, if you're diabetic, if you have all these problems, dementia, you likely benefit from this. And yet instead, what we see is, just like with economics, we see these nerds that parrot out complicated words, that obfuscate things, and then ultimately lead to you continuing to eat the garbage, confused, and not knowing what's going on. And I think the really sad thing is, how many people will, in academia, I mean, if you look at debates online, you have all these great Instagram and Twitter social media fitness influencers who've been out there training clients for years and know what works and know what doesn't work, and know that if you're overweight and you want to get in shape, lay off the junk, do this, do that, and they know what works, and they're out there arguing with these overweight, usually university professors, who are out there telling them, no, you guys are not authorities, you don't understand, you're focusing on blood sugar, that's been debunked. Here's some obscure paper from PubMed about how actually it's not blood sugar that matters, it's all these other genetics / hormonal.
They'll say it's saturated fat.
Yeah, or some other thing or the other. But, just whatever you do, just make sure you don't try to cut down on your sugar intake, and you don't lower your insulin levels. But the evidence for it, I mean, everybody who tries it, basically, I don't know anybody who's tried reducing their blood sugar levels and their insulin levels and reducing the level of inflammation that they've done and didn't feel better from it. And yet academia continues to ignore this.
Yeah.
So why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, well, I think there's competing interests, without a doubt. And I very much appreciate the audience that I have here, which is, if I may define this group in such a way, at least one attribute would be a hearty skepticism. And that's one that I share. Indeed, all scientists, by their very nature, should share that skepticism. The job of a scientist is to try to prove a theory false. And now we have this flipping of science into a religion, where people are proud to just proclaim, I believe in science. And as a scientist, I think that is a terribly unscientific way to view science. If you're a scientist, everyone should think like a scientist in a way, if I may say it like that without sounding smug, which is, we should all be trying to understand truth by challenging what we think we know. And now it is just, well, this person said something I like, and so I believe in science. Oh, but you're a scientist who's saying something different. Well, you're going to be ostracized and removed from polite society. But you brought up a lot of relevant points that I just have to elaborate on briefly. Part of the problem with conventional kind of biomedical care or clinical care is that we have based an enormous amount of our view of metabolic health purely on blood glucose. And I'm not saying blood glucose doesn't matter. But the problem with that view, this glucose-centric view of metabolic health, is that we have overlooked insulin completely. And I've given talks to clinicians, physicians and nurses and physician assistants, and I will say, we are too obsessed with glucose. We need to look at insulin. And it becomes almost a circular discussion where they will say, we don't need to look at insulin because we're measuring glucose and it's kind of the same. And I have to teach them that they're not the same, that you can have someone who's coming in every year for their annual checkup and the glucose levels are staying normal. But what's happening behind the scenes is insulin is going higher and higher and higher in order to try to keep the blood sugar in check. And that is this exact paradigm of normal glucose levels, but elevated insulin, several times higher than what it should be, is insulin resistance. And then it's only once the body has become so resistant to insulin, one of whose jobs it is to help lower glucose, that the glucose levels start to climb. And now it gets on the clinical radar. But the problem doesn't end there. So the first problem is, by failing to look at insulin, we failed to detect the problem as soon as we could detect it. But the next problem is just as bad, which is our obsession with lowering glucose. The moment the glucose does start to climb, a conventional clinician, conventional thinking, scientist and clinician, will be to say, let's just give you insulin. And like in a person who's insulin resistant, and they'll say, let's just push the insulin up. And yeah, that will lower the glucose. But the more we know, this is amply published, reviewed data for whatever that's worth, because we all got to be skeptical even of published data nowadays. But we know that the more you push insulin up in an insulin-resistant type 2 diabetic in order to control the glucose, they may have normal or ideal glucose levels, and yet we're killing them. They're 3 times more likely to die from heart disease and twice as likely to die from Alzheimer's disease and cancer. So we are killing, when we give an insulin-resistant type 2 diabetic more insulin, it's like we're giving an alcoholic another glass of wine, hoping it will solve the problem, when in reality, we're giving them more of the very thing that's causing the problem. Too much insulin is a primary driver of insulin resistance. So why on earth would we give them more insulin to try to correct the glucose? We make sure in so doing that the person gets fatter and sicker and they die faster. But so much of the problem is that the clinician, especially if these are in the US, like Medicare patients, this extends, I think the NHS in the UK has the same kind of target. Canada, I know, does. And Saif, I very much appreciated your criticism on social media of Canadian healthcare. I was born and raised in Canada, and me and all of my 8 siblings, all 9 of us, got out of Canada as quickly as we could because of, in part, the ridiculous healthcare. But nevertheless, the clinical model is based on the clinician will have targets with their patient, and it will say you need to lower their glucose by 1% of hemoglobin A1C, or lower their glucose by 20 points to try to get it into a normal range. And if they don't do it, the clinician gets punished. They do get docked on the amount of money they can bill for that patient's visits. And so the clinician has this perverse incentive to say, well, I just need to push up your insulin any way I can. And if it's making you fatter and sicker and putting you on more drugs, at least it's lowered your glucose. And that's one of the clinical markers I'm going to get graded on. But at the end of it all, underlying all of this, in my kind of concluding thought for this rant, is that while we're giving people all these clever, expensive drugs to try to lower their glucose levels, the one little rational person on the side, and I'm one of them, and I get ostracized for it. I've been criticized and I've been threatened with my position here, where you will just say, you're giving the patient all these drugs to lower their glucose. Why not just have them eat less glucose? And oh, no, you can't say that. You're accused of heresy. Truly, I've been accused of teaching principles that are against science, even though I strictly rely on published human clinical trials to defend my views, and yet it's just too heretical.
Are you suggesting that people can live without Doritos and Pringles every day? I mean, what kind of insane, cruel doctor are you? I know. Do you have no regard for human needs? Like, how could people? Yeah. I know. How could people not eat Twinkies every day? Like, how can you not make that the center of your worldview? And this is what it really comes down to, because I mean, you keep, as you explain, I mean, it's just insane that you would want to raise their insulin levels rather than reduce the sugar levels. I think one metaphor that I've come up with to try and explain this to people is that it's the equivalent of, you have a dirty apartment and you're trying to get somebody to clean up your apartment, and you keep hiring people to clean up the apartment. And you're somehow ignoring the fact that every day your son, say, comes into the apartment and takes a big giant jug of Pepsi and just turns it in, spills it in the middle of the room. And then the cleaning person has to spend all of their time just cleaning that up. And then everything else in the house falls apart and gets dirty, because every day we have this giant mass of sludgy sugar on everywhere that needs to be cleaned out. And so if you think the answer is hiring more cleaning people, you're not going to make it, because there's no limit to how much you can spill on in a house. Like it takes 1 second to spill an amount of liquid sludge that's going to take 3 hours to clean. It just goes everywhere, and then it requires a lot of cleaning. So it's insane that medicine takes the path of just hire more cleaning staff and don't worry about the cause of the disintegration. And that's
I mean, the paradigm ought to be, let's bring less garbage in and see what that does. Rather than
Yeah.
continuing to bring more and more garbage in and hiring more and more cleaners to try to keep up for it, let's just start
Yeah.
putting less garbage in the apartment.
This is the amazing thing, and this is the thing that none of the this is it's exactly like with economics, like with the economists, there's just never going to be a mainstream economist who has a PhD at an important university and at the Fed or any of that stuff who's going to come out and say, you know what, maybe we should just try hard money, we should try not inflating, we should try not doing all of that stuff. No, here's how my magic formula for managing the money supply is actually going to allow us to magically have government spending at no cost. Here's how I am going to defy the rules of physics and nature and allow us to eat our seed corn and still plant the same seed corn that we eat. This is essentially how it works in politics and in economics. And it's kind of what works in nutrition. And it's just the mentality of indulgence. No, we can't sacrifice the sugary treats, and we must find a way to manage it. It's like,
Yep.
you know, how do we fix laptops that get destroyed by hammers by their owners? I mean, there's just never going to be a successful science of fixing laptops destroyed by hammers, because the hammers can always destroy a laptop beyond being able to fix it. The best method is just not destroy it.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's absolutely. I believe there are sufficient competing interests that we are able to prop up so many economies, or that might not be the word to use in an audience like this. We were able to prop up so many entities by telling people to eat whatever you want, and then we have drugs and healthcare that will help you deal with the consequences. And it's just a way of spending more money on things that we could go back to that first principle of eat better. Well, all right, but then but then the drug companies aren't going to be able to sell as much drugs. Well, then the hospitals aren't going to be able to have as many sick patients. And so we have these sick-based economies that will suffer. Well, of course, we shouldn't care about that. We want to live long and healthy. But there are all these competing interests that, I mean, there was just recently a report published by the Nutrition Center at Harvard University. I mean, and this deserves all of our disdain. And again, it makes me ashamed of academia and my fellow quote unquote scientists, where they ranked mini wheats cereal higher than eggs and steak on the scale of nutrition. In other words, mini wheats was better by a wide margin. They said that frosted mini wheats, the cereal, is better for someone than eggs and better for someone than steak. I don't know on what planet that could be stated other than there's sufficient competing interests. Like take, for example, the American Dietetics Association, which promotes a lot of these things. Look at who funds them. It is not the American Ranchers Association. They wish they could fund them, but the American Dietetics Association is so opposed to animal-based products, much to the detriment of every human on the planet. But it's just who's paying the bills. I mean, that's a very cynical view, and it's not been comfortable for me, because it has made it difficult for me to stay in good standing with, say, example, the American Diabetes Association, where the conventional advice, even to a type 2 diabetic who has plenty of insulin in their body, it is literally eat whatever you want, but cover it with your insulin. Just give yourself more insulin. Yeah, it's a wonderful way to sell insulin. It's a wonderful way to make sure these patients are going to the hospital very, very often because they're very, very sick. We could just say, you know what, eat a little better. By that, we mean eat less glucose. If you're insulin resistant, that, as most people are worldwide, this is not an American unique to the West. This is very much a problem in Southeast Asia. It's very much a problem in the Middle East. The most diabetic countries on the planet are in the Middle East, numbers 1 through 9. And this is a global situation. We just have to tell the people, eat less processed sugars and processed grains. If that is just the simplest step, that's number one. For me, that is first principle number one: control carbohydrates, because it's refined carbohydrates that are going to spike insulin the most and keep it elevated. And the sooner we lower insulin, the sooner all these metabolic issues, including Alzheimer's disease, including certain cancers, start to get better.
Yeah, and if if you have an internet connection and you're even marginally curious about the topic of, how not to be fat, how not to be sick, how not to be diabetic, and you just search the internet with a little bit of an open mind, you won't be able to miss the fact that there are literally millions of people around the world who have improved their health immeasurably by cutting down on eating processed foods, sugary food, foods that are high in glucose. And you know that there are thousands of different ways you can do it, thousands of different diets. Some people call it low carb, high fat. Some people do low carb, low fat. Some people do keto. Some people do paleo. But all of these things, they have one thing in common. You get far fewer glucose spikes and hence far fewer insulin spikes.
Yep.
And whichever way you take to do that, you know, my personal way to do that is just I eat only red meat and I drink only water, and it's perfect because
that's a dynamite way. I mean, really, Saif, it's so funny to me. Everyone raves these days about, oh, eat this berry, it's a superfood, or this kale green, it's a superfood, and it's so silly to me. It is so silly because if you want to talk to me, I would say a superfood is a food that literally gives you every nutrient you need in order to survive. Well, that is any ruminant meat. So beef.
Exactly.
If someone eats beef or really any ruminant animal, they're going to literally get every nutrient they need to survive. And that is why, like you mentioned, a human can literally eat nothing but beef and survive and thrive. That's right. Not just survive. They will thrive. The strongest, leanest, healthiest people I know are the people who are just pure carnivore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've tried it myself. I started doing it, I think, by the end of this month, it'll be 7 years. And it's really been 7 years, and there's no going back. Like once you've tried being Superman, once you've tried being Superman, you never want to eat kryptonite again.
That's right.
You know?
Well said.
You always want to be Superman. And but I mean, I understand, you know, not everybody wants to go this far, but still, if you're going to want to make a difference in your health, you have to reduce the amount of insulin spikes that you get. And it's such a simple idea, and it's so easy. There are so many low-hanging fruits that you could take out of your diet. I mean, I remember when I first became curious about this. I mean, it's just simply being aware about not eating the bread before the lunch that they put there at the restaurant, reducing the amount of bread in the sandwich, cutting out the excess soda that I was drinking, just drinking a little bit of soda. I mean, just these low-hanging fruits that now sound completely undesirable to me, but just these tiny little changes that weren't even a big issue immediately made a huge difference in my health.
Yeah.
And everybody I know who's done this has witnessed this. Now, for me, I just kept on removing more things and just feeling better and better and better. And I've continued to go on, but I see it with so many people that it's amazing for me that so many people don't notice just this. Think from this perspective of just pick the low-hanging fruit. And that's a far better use of your time than arguing with academics about PubMed on Twitter. I mean, this is the thing why, I mean, I honestly, there's absolutely nothing that you could ever show me that is written in PubMed that will matter to me more than what I know from what my body feels.
You're in
because I look, my N of 1, which is me, my own body. I've tried, because this is the thing, the scientific thing. You know, people talk about science. They think science is, you know, you just go and read on PubMed what some Procter & Gamble sponsored scientist had to write in order to keep his job, and you think that that's science. No, that's not science. That's appeal to authority. As the exact opposite of science. Science is experimentation. So actually try and remove this from your food, see how you feel, look at your blood sugar levels, look at your insulin levels, look at all these health problems that you have. You know, you'll be able to tell if they're improving or they're getting worse. That there's no escaping it. It's your body. You'll be able to tell. And most people just completely ignore that and won't want to look at it. And this is why I you know, the term fiat science is accurate in many ways. It's not just that it's financed by fiat, but it's also that it intends to enforce this fiat scientific reality by fiat. You know, that by rule. It's not just by fiat money. It's also by government rule. Like this, no, your body can handle a diet consisting of Twinkies and Doritos, and there's nothing wrong with it, because here's a bunch of garbage in PubMed that proves it. Because it's
in fact, they would go further. They would literally say, you're better for it. Eat these sugary cereals and it is better for you. Not only you can handle it, they will literally rank it and give it a green good score. I mean, all it does is encourage indulgence, promoting sickness, propping up industries and entities that have no business surviving.
And the truly criminal thing about it is not just that you're promoting something that's highly addictive, that's designed to be highly addictive. It's designed by food scientists who've spent decades figuring out the exact best combinations to trigger the reward centers in your brain to make you a slave to that Oreo
Yep.
cookie or to that Snickers bar, whatever
Yep.
it is. These people know what they're doing. So there's the notion, that Harvard has popularized this idea that everything is good in moderation
Oh,
is extremely pernicious. It's
oh,
extremely
oh,
pernicious.
I agree.
It's
I
criminal.
rail against that view. The moderation in all things is a popular dietitian's bannering, like rallying cry. And all that is a justification for indulgence. And it totally ignores the fact that most people can't moderate. I have to
Can't
quote,
moderate highly addictive
well, that's my
junk.
point. And so there was this beautiful quote by St. Augustine who said, abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. And so they would say, well, just have one small bowl. I kind of come back to cereal, like mini wheats, because that's kind of my addiction that I'm aware of. Like they will say, just eat one little bowl of cereal. And sure, if you could only eat one little bowl of cereal, a half cup or whatever the serving size is, all right, you could get away with that for a long time, but you don't. You never stop there. And so it is easier for the person to look at that ice cream or that bread or whatever and just say, I know that once I start eating it, I won't stop until I've eaten half the loaf, or I won't stop until I've eaten that whole pint of ice cream. And so I'm just not going to start. So moderation in all things ignores human tendency, as most people do, to engage in addictive, self-destructive behaviors, especially with foods that are literally, as you said, designed to be addictive. And they always consist of refined starches and sugars. Say, nobody is sitting around on a Friday night. The kids are in bed, the house is clean, they turn on a show with their significant other, and they say, oh man, I sure could use a plate of scrambled eggs. No one is sitting there craving scrambled eggs. What they crave is something sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy. It's going to be a refined carbohydrate. And that is why my rule number one, control carbs. And the easiest way to do that is if it comes in a bag or a box with a barcode, avoid it. Don't even open it. It's not going to work. If you're going to have a carbohydrate, keep it in as unadulterated form as possible, a whole fruit or a whole vegetable. But then don't just think. What I would worry is that in this conversation so far, people are only hearing this kind of denial, avoid this. But in order for it to be sustaining, you need to replace it. So replace it with protein and fat, which have little to no insulin effect. Those are, for me, rules number 2 and 3. 1, control carbs. 2, prioritize protein from animal sources. And 3, don't fear fat. Every animal protein on the planet, which are the best proteins for humans to eat, well, every organism to eat that can, every animal protein comes with fat. There is literally no exception to that. Don't be afraid of the fat that comes with that protein. You will digest it better. You will digest the protein better, and it will help blunt the insulin, the even modest insulin response to the protein. Steak, the best protein, it has fat. Eggs, egg whites, the best protein, it has the yolk. There's no exception. So protein and fat come together. That's how we should eat it. Don't try to avoid all that fat. It is nutritious. It is, in fact, essential. We need to have it. But those are the 3 rules of an insulin controlling, life promoting diet.
Yeah, I'll my personal advice that I give to people who do this, and again, of course, I'm not a doctor. Be sure to check with your obese doctor.
Yeah.
He
Neither of us
probably
are
knows
giving clinical advice
exactly.
here, but we would give it better than.
Yeah, but I mean, what I tell people is the best way to avoid carbohydrates is you don't want to fight a defensive war where you're hungry and you're trying to restrict yourself. That doesn't work.
That's right.
I mean, it can work, but it requires an enormous amount of willpower.
Yep.
But you don't have to do that. That's really punishing yourself. That's like, you're playing a soccer game blindfold if you're trying to do it with that. There's no reason to do that to yourself. The best way to do it is to fill yourself up with protein and fat first thing in the morning every day. Think of that as almost like your job. You wake up and the first thing you do is you focus on getting at least a pound of fatty red meat in you, and then you've already won 90% of the battle against these carbohydrates, because the cravings are going to be very different. If you've had a pound of beef and you see a pint of ice cream, it's very different if you've had a pound of beef and you haven't had a pound of beef. It's completely different. So I say, I personally don't usually have breakfast. I usually have 2 meals a day.
Yep.
Yeah, but I think in the transition period, if you're used to eating sugary food and you want to cut down on sugar, I would recommend starting the day with fatty meat and just filling up on it, and then that's going to reduce. Without you even putting in any effort, you're just going to end up eating less sugar than you usually do.
Well, I 100%. I agree with this perspective completely, and indeed, Saif, I would say there is significant human evidence to defend this. So, as much as I also criticize the published body of literature, the tragedy is there are all of these valid gems that have been published and just completely overlooked because it doesn't fit the popular, that fiat narrative, which is we have to promote something in order to generate this kind of artificial wealth through drug companies and medicine. But if a person can follow the adage of breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner or supper like a pauper, this idea of this kind of scaling down throughout the day, if you can, so I also don't eat breakfast, so I will eat a big, hearty, filling lunch. I eat lunch and it's fat and protein almost exclusively. And then when I go home several hours later to have dinner with my family, which is sacrosanct for me, I want to have dinner with my family. And then I will eat a very modest dinner. And then I'm still kind of full from lunch. And then in the evening, no snacking, no snack. Once a person has had dinner, stop eating. You do not want to go to bed on a full stomach, and you do not want to go to bed having just spiked your insulin and glucose. That is, in my view, the primary reason why people sleep poorly. If you go to bed with spiked glucose, you will have an activation of your heart rate. Your heart will be beating faster and harder, and your body temperature will be higher. And you'll be thinking, I can't sleep because I have such anxiety. No, that's an artificial anxiety activated by your nervous system in response to what you just did metabolically. But tragically, that is when most people indulge the most. It's in the evening. That's when they eat all of these sugar, insulin spiking foods. It's literally the worst time to be eating it. So I agree wholeheartedly. Eat the bulk of your calories in the earlier part of the day so that you can taper off as you go into the afternoon and evening.
Yeah. And generally, it's a great rule to not snack. I think of it this way. If you have the desire to snack less than 12 hours after your last meal did not contain enough red meat.
Well said. That's a good rule.
Yeah, this is how you know, have I eaten enough red meat? Like, there's no magic number of pounds of beef that you need to eat every day that applies for every person. It depends on you, your body, your size, the amount of effort that you put in, and every day. But a good rule of thumb is you should definitely not be craving anything in the next 12 hours. If you ate enough, then the next 12 hours, food doesn't even cross your mind. This is the right way to go about it. And initially it's going to be more difficult because you're still a sugar addict and there's an adjustment. But the easiest way to handle that adjustment is to just douse it with fatty beef.
No. In fact, to speak on that point of adjusting, the body is an energetic hybrid. Where at any moment, the body has two primary metabolic fuels that it's relying on, which is blood sugar or fat. Those are the two fuels. At any moment, the body is primarily sugar burning or it's primarily fat burning. And that is entirely 100% dictated by insulin. When insulin is elevated, it shifts the metabolic engine to sugar burning. When insulin's down, the metabolic engine, if you will, shifts to fat burning. The more a person is stuck in sugar burning, the harder it's going to be to fast and not snack, because the body has a very finite amount of sugar stored in it. And so if we're always burning that sugar, that's an engine that we need to be topping up. That's a tank, a fuel tank that the person would need to feel like they have to top up frequently. But if they can kind of get through this initial adjustment stage, as you noted, then insulin starts to come down, then the body starts to shift and rely on the other fuel tank, namely fats. And even a lean person has well over 100,000 calories stored on them as fat. It's like we have all of these energy bars and energy drinks strapped onto our bodies that we just can't use because we're constantly filling up that little tank. So it's almost like, let me use the analogy of a big fuel tanker, like a big semi-truck with a big tank of fuel that it's hauling on the back. And then every 4 or 5 hours, this truck, or 6 hours, it needs to stop and fill up. And it's it needs to fill up because it's relying on this small little tank under the engine in the cab of the truck. And yet the irony is, so much of its effort is hauling around all of this other fuel that's strapped to the back of this big fuel tanker. And imagine if this engine was such that it could take the fuel lines from the engine and start tapping into all of the calories, all the energy that it's hauling around but isn't using. Well, then that truck could go for days. The analogy then, comparing it to the human body, is that we have these two energy stores. We have about 2,000 calories stored as sugar and maybe 200,000 calories stored as fat. And we keep using just that sugar, using it up, filling it up, using it up, filling it up. And any excess that we fill into that tank spills into this other tank of fat that we're never tapping into because we're constantly filling that sugar tank. So the moment we let the sugar tank run dry, and it'll be a little uncomfortable, there's that adjustment, but give it a couple days, insulin will have come down. We have basically replumbed the fuel lines to have that engine tapping in, the metabolic engine tapping into stored fat. And now when we go on a hike, it's here in the mountains of the Mountain West in Utah, my family, we go on hikes all the time. And I will see very overweight people, and they will have these little kind of fanny packs of energy bars. And you have my family, we're all lean and fit and strong and healthy. We don't have nothing but water. It's because we have enough fuel on our bodies. We're all lean, but we still have enough fuel that we could go run 50 miles, 100 miles and not run out of fuel if we were so inclined. And these people can't even hike 5 miles. They start to get hangry and uncomfortable. It's because they're stuck in sugar burning mode. And the more you eat sugar, the more you're dependent on it. And so you just have to break that. You have to just say, I'm not going to get my carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes, and I'm just going to focus on fats and proteins. It'll be a little bit uncomfortable. Give it a few days, and it'll be right as rain, and that person will have shifted to becoming a fat burner.
Yeah, this is really, it's almost like running two different kinds of operating systems in the human body. It's like there's Windows and Mac and Linux. There's fat burners and sugar burners. Yep. And I've tried being a fat burner and I've tried being a sugar burner. And if you've not tried both, people like to experiment with all kinds of things. People like to enjoy all kinds of experiences, like watching TV shows and traveling to places and consuming all kinds of things. I think you might want to consider this kind of experience. Try what it would be like to be a fat burner.
Well said.
Ever wonder what you would look like if you could put on a Superman suit?
Yeah.
That's kind of what it is.
Well, and there's another perk in addition to the ability to not be so dependent on eating every 2 hours. When a person is in a state of fat burning that gets to the order of about 16 to 20 hours, it's that acute. If insulin is low, the body starts burning so much fat but with low insulin, it can't stop. And so it's burned enough fat that it's met its energetic demand. Every cell is properly fueled. But because insulin is low, it can't stop burning fat. And so you start burning more fat than you literally need to meet your energetic needs. And that excess of fat burning turns into these molecules called ketones. And everyone's heard of ketones or keto. And unfortunately, it's a 4-letter word. It's disparaged. It's reviled. It's just because it's so misunderstood. But ketones, speaking of feeling better, we just published a paper last year looking at humans. We had post-mortem brain samples of the hippocampus, which is the kind of memory learning center. That's the part of the brain that gets compromised with Alzheimer's disease. And in these post-mortem samples, we looked at the metabolic genes related to glucose burning and ketone burning, because the brain relies on those two fuels. The brain does not burn fat. It uses fat for structure. It doesn't burn fat for fuel, unlike the rest of the body. The brain will burn sugar, like glucose, or ketones. But what we found in Alzheimer's disease is that the sugar burning becomes compromised. It can't burn sugar as well because it's become insulin resistant, but it has a perfect ability to burn ketones. And this is reflected in human case studies, case reports, where you have someone with full-blown Alzheimer's disease, either put them into a ketogenic diet or give them a ketone drink to boost up their ketones. And in real time, you detect improvements in cognition. You've not cured the disease. It's not that dramatic, unfortunately. It is irreversible to a degree. But whereas someone had such dementia that they couldn't get themselves dressed, now they can. They had such dementia that they couldn't draw the face of an analog clock, and now they can. I mean, these are true improvements that you see all by shifting the fuel. But the tragedy of the average individual is that with Alzheimer's disease, especially, which is something we're all afraid of to some degree or another, because it's such a horrifying disorder to be trapped within your own brain. But we look at the progression of this disease, and insulin resistance has a higher statistically significant correlation to Alzheimer's than age does even. I mean, this is how powerfully predictive insulin resistance is. But as the brain becomes progressively insulin resistant, you have two tragedies that occur concurrently. One, the insulin resistance of the brain means that it can't get as much glucose, and so the brain starts to go hungry. Ironically, the body is swimming in a sea of glucose, and yet the brain just can't get it. But then second, because the person is insulin resistant, they have high insulin levels, and high insulin levels inhibit any production of ketones because it shuts off fat burning. And so the brain is starving for a lack of glucose, and it's crying out for ketones that the body simply will not give it because the elevated insulin won't allow it to happen. And so the brain literally starts to starve, and you start to have dementia. And it's not only that scenario that I just described is not only relevant to Alzheimer's disease, but several other neurological disorders like migraine headaches. We have known since 1928, there are published reports from 1928 that people who frequently suffer from migraines, if you put them into a ketotic state through a ketogenic diet or fasting, they will have no more migraines. They will literally stop and be maintained. And this was repeated in studies published in 1930. With epilepsy, we've known with epilepsy for decades that you put that child into a ketotic state, they will have no epilepsy. The problem with these and other disorders is, as much as we knew that ketones are probably most therapeutic to the brain more than any other tissue in the body, they fell out of favor the moment we started developing drugs. Epilepsy was always treated with a ketogenic diet. Well, now we have these epileptic drugs, these anti-epileptics that'll help. They never work as well. Migraines, it was once treated with a ketogenic diet. Well, now we have these good migraine medications, so you should just take these instead. And the same thing happened with even type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes used to be treated by basically carnivore diet. And because the lower insulin need, lower blood glucose levels help them survive and feel better in the absence of insulin. And then the moment we kind of mass-produced insulin, which on one hand is life-saving, so I can't critique that. It does improve the life of the type 1 diabetic. There's no arguing that. But now we started to tell them, you can eat just like everybody else. Eat all that cake, eat all those cookies and breads, just cover it with your insulin. That's the line. And all it does is put the poor type 1 diabetic child on this glycemic roller coaster all day of getting too high and getting too low, as opposed to telling even the type 1, certainly the type 2 diabetic, say, control your carbohydrates. And now they basically just have a flat line of glucose all day. And their insulin needs go down to 1/10 of what it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, the truly astonishing thing here is that absolutely nothing, by any stretch of the imagination, absolutely nothing compares to cutting down on eating sugary food in terms of cost reward. I mean, it's just insane. When you look at all these other things, like, yeah, let's give them anti-epileptic drugs. Like, you think decades later now we start to see all of the side effects of those drugs and all of the problems that they cause and all of the complications that then require more drugs, which then cause even more problems. So you have that as an option. So that you sign up for a lifetime drug addiction, essentially, that doesn't work as well, and it costs a lot of money and it ruins your health. Or you just stop eating garbage and it works much better. Whether it's epilepsy, whether it's diabetes, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's all of these health issues, you see the same thing. Like it's out there, as you said, in the literature. It's already been demonstrated. It's also out there demonstrated in the real world of
literally thousands and thousands of people all over the world who started their own blogs and have their own businesses built around this. You know, the outside, I mean, thankfully, the internet has allowed people to essentially be doctors outside of the medical establishment. That's what a lot of these influencers on social media really are, and I thoroughly respect them because they are doing science. You know, they've worked with actual clients, they've trained them, they've taken their measurements, they've looked at their blood work over time, they've seen what works, they've seen what doesn't work, they've read literature, and everybody comes up with the same conclusion, like this stuff works for all kinds of different things. And it's an enormous amount of mental gymnastics you have to do to avoid that very obvious, very low cost, very high return in the intervention, and think of other things. And really, this is I think if you're in the medical field and if you're in the scientific research field and you're listening to this, of course, there's a little bit of defensive-ness of, oh, well, how do you know? Well, you're not a PhD in biology, and how do I talk
well,
about
and
it?
neither of us are MDs, right?
Yeah, neither of us are MDs, and how do I know? And of course, all of these people will claim expertise, but really, if your expertise has resulted in you not being able to notice that by far the most effective intervention that could possibly be done is reducing the level of insulin resistance in a patient through dietary control, then I'm sorry, but your entire degree and all of your education, if it is in any sense related to this, and you've missed this lowest hanging fruit, this absolute elephant of a fruit that is low hanging right there for you to pick, and you've managed to miss that, but instead you've studied all this extremely sophisticated, arcane academic discussion about all these cells and genetics and all of these other arcane things.
Drug mechanisms. Yep.
Drug mechanisms and all of these acronyms and names, and all of these people that are so expert in all those things. Really, if you've managed to miss that, hey, cut down on Doritos first, and you're talking about all these extremely sophisticated scientific concepts that you think you're better than normal people because you understand them and normal people don't understand them, I am sorry, but you've been scammed. You've been scammed. Yep. Your education is a big, giant, stupid scam, and you have been conned into wasting your life into joining a giant criminal enterprise.
Yeah, you've been credentialed.
Yeah, you're helping a bunch of criminals profit from people getting sick. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, you've been credentialed to become a legal drug dealer.
Exactly.
This dissonance that I developed, I think my first loss of innocence, just to really put a fine point on what we're describing, in addition to, I'll add that humans are great self-deceivers. We fool ourselves. During the course of my PhD in North Carolina, I would go from our little home and I would bike. I biked all the time. We only had one car, and my wife was home with our new baby. I would bike to the medical school where I took most of my PhD courses, the biochemistry, the bioenergetics, the physiology, etc. I would have to bike. Even though it was less convenient for me, I would bike on the opposite side of the road of where the med school was, because I had to go to the far side of the medical school, because the sidewalk of the medical school block was filled with nurses and doctors who were technically off the property of the hospital to go to the sidewalk in order to smoke. They would go to the sidewalk so they could smoke. And so there were so many that would be along there all the time that I had to bike on the other side of the road. And I would look at these healthcare professionals and just wonder at the hypocrisy or the ignorance or the self-delusion, where you could imagine a physician who would be out there smoking a cigarette, go back in for a clinical appointment with a patient who has lung failure and heart disease, and he would look at the patient's chart and say, well, looks like you smoke half a pack or a pack of cigarettes a day. You really got to stop smoking. And yet the stench of his own cigarette smoke comes into the clinical appointment with him. This is, and another something I see as a parent, you'll see, I've literally seen this happen. A mom is at a playground with her child, and the mom has a little bag of candies. And the little child comes up to mom, hey, can I have some candy? And the mom will give the little kid a small little handful. Here's some little gummy candies. Now, don't ask for any more. You've had enough. This isn't good for you to have too much. And then the moment that little child ran away, I saw them. What did the mom start doing? It's just hand over fist, shoving those gummy candies into her sick body, her sick, overweight body. And I thought, these moments of hypocrisy, one, I took it to heart and analyzed my own behavior, thinking, Where am I hypocritical? Where I will tell my child, okay, you've watched TV for an hour, that's enough, no more. And then I will go and watch it for 4 hours. I mean, just as an example, it made me analyze my own behavior more, to be mindful of my own hypocrisy. But then it just was such an obvious display of the hypocrisy that just pervades human nature, including those who, well, especially because it is such blatant hypocrisy, those who know better. We know that if you are insulin resistant, you're a type 2 diabetic or type 1, literally your disease could be defined as you have a hard time metabolizing sugar in your blood. That's why your sugar is climbing. Why on this good green earth would we then tell the person, which entities do, American Dietetics, American Diabetes, American Heart, they will say, eat a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. That is literally the dietary advice that these entities promote.
Literally
they will say
criminal.
It is criminal, and yet there must be such cognitive dissonance because they know the blood sugar levels are getting too high. Well, then, as I already said, and I hate that I'm repeating myself, just put less sugar in the system, and it will lower the sugar. It will lower the insulin, then the insulin resistance, which is the heart of all metabolic problems, and then all of the issues that are derivative of that. Everything starts to get better. Rather than trimming this sick little tree at the branches by giving here a medication or there a medication, we just chop the damn thing down, and now we don't have to worry about pruning it anymore.
Yeah, one of the absolutely most heartbreaking things that happen when you start learning about how this whole insulin mechanism works, and you see the difference in you, is you try and tell your family and friends. And one of the worst thing is when you have a family member who's clearly suffering from serious health problems and clearly could benefit enormously from them, and they might even be willing to listen, except that their doctor told them, no, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Focus on taking your medication and be sure to come to my office once every 2 weeks so that we could check your whatever it is. But don't listen to your nephew or grandkid or all of these people that are reading weird things on the internet. I have a degree. This is, think about things that make you go really, really, really angry. This is
and you can't say one of the dirty secrets, especially of medical practice. I saw this firsthand. I was a group of I think there were 4 of us PhD students taking classes, not to let PhDs off the hook. We know that it is plenty corrupted, but we were taking classes with the MD medical students, like the physiology and the biochemistry and stuff, some of them. And then we had our own other coursework. I was amazed that if we PhD students got anything less than a B, we were on academic probation. And then we had to repeat the class. And if we got less than a B again, thankfully never happened with me, but then you get kicked out of the program. So our PhD program went from 4 to 3 within the first year. I knew multiple MD students who they don't have to just they could get a C, and they can take that again as many times as they need. I knew a guy his graduation from his medical degree was delayed about 1.5 years or so because he kept failing a class. And yet it's just once you're in the system, they move heaven and earth. All the more now. I mean, standards just keep getting lower and lower as we have all these outcomes that are based more on ensuring, I need to be careful, ensuring just, that everyone can have a chance and everyone gets a degree. They're just handing them out. And so there's no question that the quality is getting less and less. But also, tragically, as the quality is declining, it seems like there's a growing resistance to acknowledging when you don't know something. It is the great tragedy of all terminal degrees. A PhD and an MD are obvious examples. The more we have earned letters after our name, the more we refuse to acknowledge someone could know something that we don't know. And that, to me, it's the death of science. It truly is. And science is just true science, which is the pursuit of truth. That my PhD mentor, who was a wonderful gentleman, just a wonderful man, he would always say, Ben, we're seeking truth. We're seeking truth. And that means you have to be prepared to dump all of your theories the moment you see data that conflict it, that challenge it. It should make you challenge what you thought you knew and readdress it, reassess. But no, now, like I said at the outset of the conversation, everyone, they have lawn signs and they say, we believe in science. And all it is the declaration of faith at that point. It is no longer a rigorous, objective analysis of what we think we know. And this is all, COVID was the death of
yeah.
I mean, it was the death
science.
nail. Yep.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think the really astonishing bait and switch here is that the whole supposed marketing material of science was built on the idea that no more priests, no more authority, no more listen to what the priests say. No, you need to read for yourself. Everybody uses the scientific method. You think scientifically, and it's really just an explicit statement of what all humans do at all times. When you wake up in the morning, let's say your bed has a wall on one side and it doesn't have a wall on the other side. It's the scientific method. One day you wake up, you hit the wall, and then you've experimented. And then for the rest of your life, you're going to wake up on the right side of the bed. That's science. That's what the scientific method is. You have a hypothesis that if I could wake up on the left side, you test it out, you smash your head in the wall, and then you figure out the conclusion that you should try the other side. So thinking scientifically is what humans naturally do when they try and understand how things work. And the scientific process is a great way of thinking about it, formulating it to make it systematic, so that it's not just going by a hunch. So you formulate a hypothesis, you test it, and you write it down. It helps you structure your thinking in a much better way. But with that, we've successfully been conned into all right, we're doing experiments, but actually what we're going to be doing is that you're not doing experiments. You're just going to trust priests who claim to do experiments. But these are better than the other priests that you trusted, because the other priests told you, they spoke to God. These guys don't speak to God. They speak to an experiment. So you can feel okay trusting them. But really, it's the same thing. It is a religion. Like at this point, we just have priests and we trust them, and we excommunicate people who don't believe in that.
Well said. In fact, I used to take great pride in being what is commonly called a hard scientist. The hard sciences were these areas of science where you could literally conduct an experiment, run the analysis, and see, was this a significant finding or was it not? Did something happen that we predicted or did it not? I would take great pride that I was not a soft science guy, where you add the word science in your degree and it helps you believe it's political science, social science.
Run a bunch of observationary data.
Yeah, there's nothing science. I mean, it's almost a rule where if a degree has the word science in it, it's probably not a science. Like I am in cell biology. That's my department. We don't say my other colleagues are in molecular biology. We don't say molecular biology science, but it's social science, political science. And I would take such pride that I could know something. I could say, this is truth. What we saw, this happened. I treated the cells with insulin, and this is literally what happened. So now I can state it with an absolute authority because it is truth. It is reality. And unlike the social sciences, the softer sciences, which I don't mean to totally disparage, but they could not make those same claims. They could not do it. But now, even in the hard sciences, you have people making claims that are not justified. I've never been more ashamed of my credential than I have been the last few years, where it has been, you have people making the most unscientific, ridiculous statements across a whole spectrum of social issues right now. It's not just disease, but it is, human development. These things are being criticized in a way that I look at with such wonder, and I'm left thinking, I'm in a clown world now. But you know what?
Not the only one.
No, I know, but it's funny for me to say this because I happen to be a professor at a private religious university. And what's amazing to me is to see that it's these private religious universities that still allow the teaching of traditional kind of liberal education. By that, I don't mean, but when I say liberal, I mean like a classic liberal education, which trains you in the arts and the sciences and the letters. And I can know that my institution will defend me when I make statements about reality and truth in science. And I don't teach anything religious whatsoever, but it's these state-sponsored schools who are so dependent on money from the National Institutes of Health or from the state or federal agencies, unlike my institution, where they have to say what they have to follow the party line. That, to your point about fiat science being based on fiat money, that is literally the case with traditional state schools. And it's only universities that aren't dependent. Like my university, for example, when the federal government was handing out COVID relief funds, my university was we literally declined the money. It was offered these tens of millions of dollars, and my university said, no, we aren't going to take it. Because we know the moment you start doing that things, it comes with obligations and demands. And so it's a weird thing to say that it's these private, generally religious universities, and there are very, very few of them, that actually teach the reality, the binary nature of just science. Something is real or it isn't. Now, that's not to say there's no silliness. College campuses, unfortunately, it's their very nature nowadays to have some somewhat crazy ideology in some disciplines, but it would be increasingly difficult for me to be in academia if I felt like I had to state something that I believed to be utterly false.
Yeah, I mean, better get some Bitcoin, because I think
I know.
I think the Inquisitors are coming, and you're going to have to recant on all of your heresies. You're going to have to cancel
be excommunicated.
Exactly. Denounce your previous work and say that insulin is not a problem anymore.
Oh, I know. Well, but the nice thing for me, I've never gotten an NIH grant, and that's actually, I'm not ashamed of that. That's kind of a point of pride. I have been able to fund my lab through individual donors that are sufficiently enamored or convinced, have a sufficient conviction of my view of health and disease, that I've not had to become an employee of the government and say what they want me to say.
Congratulations. Really, this is for me, this is the goal, and this was always the goal: write and be read, and have a method of communicating with the readership without having to be part of the state-run educational system, because ultimately the entire fields, they're all related to the academic journals. And I discussed this in detail in the Fiat Standard. The way that this academic Fiat Ponzi works is all run through the academic journals. Basically, the better way to understand is that the university system and the university professors and the university administrators have effectively been conned into becoming the slave labor for the academic publication industry. So there are a few large publishers that control literally thousands upon thousands of academic journals. And 99.999% of everything written in all those academic journals is unreadable garbage. Nobody ever reads it. None of these papers are read by anybody.
Even if you have access to it.
Yeah, even if you had access to it, nobody would read it. The only people who read it are people who read it because they want to respond to it or build upon it so that they can get into the same journals and get promoted. But nobody outside of the journal circle jerk reads these papers.
No, in fact, I joke, it's incestuous. I say that all the time. You go to conventional meetings. I go give a talk at a conventional science meeting. It's the same handful of scientists listening to the same handful of scientists. Everyone's citing each other's work, and that's why when at the very beginning of our conversation, I noted that I began more and more to rail against this system where I'd publish a paper like this paper about the post-mortem biopsies we did on studying the hippocampus from humans. This was relevant, cool stuff. And we pay $5,000 to get it published in a journal that no one will read except a handful of people. And conventional academia would say all that matters. Like at the end of every year, you get reviewed in part based on how many people cited your published work. That's part of the game of academia. And yet I looked at this like about 6 years ago. This was the beginning of me saying, I need to, one, get involved in social media, and two, I need to write a book. Because I thought if the rest of my career is publishing papers that 20 other scientists read and it never actually impacts a human's life, then I will have ended my career. Either I was delusional thinking I made a difference, or I will acknowledge and be humbled by the fact that I never made a lick of difference, and every discovery I made, as cool as I might have thought it was totally irrelevant in the real world. And that to me was intolerable. The idea of just sitting in the ivory tower of academia, spouting ideas, and then wondering if they had ever influenced someone. I said, no, I have to circumvent that whole system. Yes, I have to play that game. I do. I play it. but I also know that I'm playing the game. And then I go right to the people. I directly share publications that are relevant to human health through social media. And it's never pictures of me doing anything silly. It's literally just, I'm teaching a little lesson right now about how testosterone affects fat cell function, for example. Or I'm writing a book that is directly me going around. I mean, Saif, if you had to convey all of your ideas in the 2 books that I've read of yours, Bitcoin Standard and Fiat Standard, if you had to only rely on those ideas being conveyed in a classroom, you'd never, or your own papers being published, no, good luck. A fraction of the number of people would know it. So those of us who know ideas, and that's not relegated to those with PhDs, not at all, but those who have valuable ideas, it behooves us to test those ideas in an open market. Are these ideas as valid as I think they are? And then how can I help convey them if they are? And the market will tell you if they're valuable or not.
Exactly, which is what I really love about Twitter. Twitter in particular, I think, is the most vigorous intellectual and scientific debate that you find.
May it always stay that way. May it stay that way.
Oh, obviously, of course, it has all of its problems with censorship and so on. But yet, even in spite of all of that, I think it still manages to be the most effective platform because it's extremely powerful as a way of communication where you need to get things down to 280 characters. So that means you can't waffle around and you can't waste people's time. People just immediately tune you out. Get straight to the point. So, you can link to papers, you can link to articles, you can include video and audio, but you need to get to the punch in 280 points, which forces the brain to focus and allows you to really expose things. And then that's where academics really their tricks.
Yeah, no, academics don't like brevity. Academics don't like brevity. They like to be superfluous in everything they describe.
Exactly, because a lot of it is just honestly performative art. I mean, I've been to those conferences and I know that a lot of it is just you need to sit there and talk about your paper. Nobody has read your paper. Nobody wants to read your paper, but they have to attend the conference. You have to speak at the conference. And so it's just performance. You stand there and, you feign being wise and you talk slowly and then you finish your time and then you get on with your life. And nobody learns anything. And most of it is just really performative. But yeah, that's social media, on the other hand, is real world. That people are going to listen to your ideas and they're going to try them. And they're going to come back and tell you, hey, I tried to do what you said and look, it's worked. And here are the pictures. And that's the validation that you need. I remember, it was something very similar that I felt during my grad school when I stopped believing in the stuff that they teach us in the grad school and I just developed this alternative perspective. The biggest horror that I had was this idea that, hang on, so we're just writing all of this garbage to continue to keep our jobs in this kind of system. And the only purpose of writing this is so that we develop the expertise so that we can get on TV and newspapers and university classroom and gaslight people into telling them, hey, inflation is actually good for you and prices aren't really rising. And we need more inflation. And the way that we solve the problems of inflation is with more inflation. That was basically it. And just realizing that you're sitting there and you're writing something that nobody's going to be reading, it gave me that image of that, and I mentioned this in the Fiat Stand as well. There's that movie, the Stanley Kubrick movie, The Shining, where the author and his wife, they go into a resort, into an isolated hotel in the middle of nowhere, and they spend months writing, and then his wife looks at all of the hundreds of pages that he wrote, and they're all just the same sentence all over again. And this is what it feels like when you're in academia. It's like, would it even matter if I just filled this with the same sentence over and over, the same exact sentences in that movie? Would anybody even notice? I mean, yeah, the 7 people in the journals and the 7 people who read the journal might notice. But like if them and we all agree on doing this as a prank, nobody would notice. It could well stay in the journals.
In fact, that's been done, right? There was this, I can't remember his name. There was this physicist.
Alan Sokal.
He had such disdain for. In fact, did you cite this in your book?
Yes, Alan Sokal. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So but I'd heard it other times where you have the physicist who writes a report about, like, he just made up, like, one of them. I think he might have been the guy who talked about how dogs having sex was a good example of, like, male domination or whatever. And but that was one of the things he'd made up, just utter nonsense, and getting it published in these soft science journals. The peer review process was just a joke.
Yeah, and like I think usually it used to be that a natural scientist would laugh at social scientists, but I think these are the same universities that publish the same thing. So
Oh no, I know. Yeah, that's why I
natural
said I
science,
used to.
yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
I don't anymore. My smugness at being a hard natural scientist is gone now because
yeah.
we've also now started compromising truth to fit a narrative, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think as you said, the recent respiratory illness shenanigans were really, I mean, the way that the entire world scientific community went from having never heard about social distancing and to just suddenly
Yep.
saying, yeah, well, this is obviously what we need to do because that's the only option. What are you, crazy for
Yeah,
not
well, and
agreeing
to
to do that?
totally overlook what we knew very very early on. Not to maybe I need to be very careful, but very briefly, we knew very early on that the most literally the single most relevant risk factor in determining whether this would be serious infection or a very mild infection was the amount of fat a person had on their body, and that's not just a coincidence. Any inhaled or virus that gets into the system, it comes in as a viral particle and it needs to hijack a cell. It needs to get into a cell, infect a cell for that cell to start producing more of those viral particles to go and infect others. With this particular virus, infects fat cells more than any other cell. Well, there are a couple a little higher, but fat cells are among the most readily infected cells with this particular viral particle. And then the fat cell becomes an unwitting factory producing more and more and more of it because it had on the surface of the fat cell these other proteins that allow the viral particle to get into that cell much more readily. So literally, if you had a fat cell and a muscle cell side by side, and each were exposed to this viral particle, it's going to have a very hard time getting into the muscle cell because it doesn't have the right receptors for that virus to kind of trick. Fat cells are very welcoming hosts. And so a person who has more fat tissue just had more likely infection sites. This isn't meant to be an incriminating point about anyone who's overweight. No, indeed, truly I'm not. But for us to pretend that that wasn't a relevant variable, in fact, arguably the most relevant variable, it did no one any service.
No, it's absolutely insane. I think it's the most absurd moment of the entire 2 years was when
and I'm from Alberta.
Doug Ford.
I'm from Alberta, which means I have a great disdain for any of the eastern provinces.
Yeah, I can understand. And this guy, he locked down. Ontario had some of the most strict lockdowns in the world for a very long time, and they destroyed small businesses. Doug Ford got on TV and taught his citizens how to make cheesecake, his mom's or his grandma's recipe for cheesecake, which has made Doug Ford, the enormous unit which he is today. So you can imagine how much sugar it has in it. And he went and cooked it. As he was wearing a giant T-shirt that said, "We're all in this together," and he was teaching people how to cook cheesecake while he locked them at home and prevented them from opening their businesses. It's absolutely amazing how nobody said anything about
It was for me. Yep. That was for me. Seeing everything that happened over the last few years was a kind of final nail in the coffin. Now, of course, my field itself, studying the origins of metabolic disease, had made me already somewhat cynical of traditional views. I've mentioned before that the fat cell is at the heart of metabolic problems. That's where insulin resistance starts. And yet traditional view would be, well, then just simply lower calories and that's all there is to it. Yes, calories matter, but the prevailing paradigm with obesity is this caloric paradigm totally ignores or totally refutes the fact that insulin could have anything to do with it. And yet insulin is essential to determining fat storage as well. The whole debacle the last 3 years settled it for me. But anyway, here he is.
Here he is.
Yeah, look at that guy. Oh my gosh. Yeah, and so he ought to have been worried about this respiratory illness because he has the most significant risk factor. Boy, look at him.
He's had the recipe memorized since he was 10-year-old. I mean, this is.
Oh my gosh.
This is some serious dedication.
Yeah, it is. It is. There's the cream. So what he's mixing here, the mix of sugar and fat is a particularly dangerous one. There's the cream, a little more sugar, a little more fat and sugar. And in nature, it's important to note, in nature, carbohydrate and fat don't come together. That doesn't happen in foods that we eat in nature. It's either pure carbohydrate in the form of fruit and vegetable, generally, or it's protein and fat. But he's mixing. Oh gosh, what a clown.
Yeah, he got reelected as well. I mean, just
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. They reelected Trudeau. It's so shameful to see what's happened. And I loved growing up in Canada. I loved my childhood in this little kind of farm town in Alberta. But my dad raised us all to be very kind of free market capitalist, and he would always rail against the lack of a kind of federalist system. Now, I'm not saying the U.S. is perfect. Its democracy, its federalist system is built and only can succeed on a moral people, as the founding fathers noted. And the loss of kind of morality in the U.S. puts it into a difficult spot. In fact, Saif, I've heard you defend a monarchy before, and which I can be very sympathetic to. I think if a population could know that it would always have a just king, slam dunk. But the U.S. perspective was, we can't trust that we'll always have a good king. We'll trust the morality of the people. But now, if you don't have a moral people, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I think the argument is not that, if we can get a just king every single time. I think the argument is that you hit the nail right on the head, that you need a just people for a democracy to work. So you need a society to be 51% just, moral, and low time preference. I think this is the really key thing. You need a society to be predominantly thinking about the future, thinking about their children,
well said.
Because otherwise they will sacrifice the future for the sake of the present.
That's something you've articulated very well before. I love it.
And the difficult thing is that if it's a democracy, then it's Hoppe describes it as, we stand all together where everybody's hand is in everybody's pocket and everybody is robbing from everybody else. And when you have that system, you incentivize people to think short term. And so it's very difficult to, win the lottery then and have 51% of the population manage to do it. But with a king, you just need one guy to teach their son this is what we do. We keep thinking of the long term and we don't sacrifice the long term for the present. And so then if you just have one family where you have one father who just needs to teach this to their son, and then they manage to keep it going for a few generations, you're arguably better off sticking to them than you are.
I agree, because then their moral view would be, for lack of a better word, imposed, and the population, it would be better. I totally agree with that.
I think it's not so much that they would be able to impose their moral view. I think it's just that without a high time preference person in charge of government, people just naturally do what's best for them, and they naturally develop a long-term perspective. Because what you need to destroy that is an actively destructive government that takes away your property, takes away your freedom, takes away your security. Then people become essentially animals fighting against each other because they don't see a common future, because they think the future is compromised. So this would be it. But I wanted to get back to Alzheimer's. You'd mentioned this is of course very interesting. I have my grandfather, unfortunately, who suffers from this illness, and of course, as I mentioned, it's one of those examples where constantly trying to get them to change their diet, and the doctor just says it's not, and everybody in the family just laughs when I mention it. But it's recently new research on Alzheimer's has shown us that apparently fiat science has been naughty and up to its usual tricks.
In fact, it is the most perfect example of fiat science. In science at its worst, or agenda at its best, where the prevailing theory of Alzheimer's disease has been that it is a disease of plaques forming in the brain. And these little things called amyloid beta peptides, or what we call plaques, are accumulate in the hippocampus and literally disrupt neuron to neuron connection, resulting in the cognitive decline that so typifies Alzheimer's disease. But the challenge, why my lab challenged that, among other labs, I'm not alone in this, is that there would be drug after drug would come out that would be shown to reduce the presence of amyloid beta peptides or plaques in the brain. And yet there would be no subsequent improvement in cognition. In fact, this just happened last year, where the FDA, against the request of the special panel that was put together to review this anti-Alzheimer's drug, it was an anti-plaque drug, So there was this special panel put together to review it. They directed the FDA to decline FDA approval of this drug because the efficacy was nil. There was nothing to it. But the FDA approved it anyway. And their justification for it was that they didn't want to discourage further drug development in the Alzheimer's realm. So they explicitly approved a drug they knew had no benefit. And so doctors would start prescribing this to patients, even though there was no known benefit. But all of this is just the cherry on top of the sick foundation, which was that the very idea that Alzheimer's was a plaque-based disease was built on faulty data. And that's what you're referring to. It's made the headlines. I wouldn't be surprised if many people have seen this already. But this initial scientific findings published in these glamorous journals, of course, it was that when they would block the formation of the plaques in these animal models, then the Alzheimer's would go away. When the plaques were there, the dementia, the cognitive decline in the rodents would follow. And yet it was all fabricated. They had made up these data. And that's part of this perverse incentive that so typifies this artificial realm of fiat science, where they need to publish and they need to keep getting funding. And so you're willing to compromise. And now we know that idea is been tossed to the wayside. It simply doesn't have, moreover, additional data in postmortem human samples found that there you would detect and find plaques in people's brain who died with no evidence of cognitive decline. They were perfectly healthy, as sharp and witty as they ever were, and yet their brains had more plaques and died with, like my own grandma did, and they would have no plaques or very, very little plaques in the brain. So we've known for years that there's something wrong with this paradigm, and yet it continued to be propped up. And those of us who've been beating the drum, and again, I'm not alone, saying that this is not a plaque disease, it is a metabolic disease with significant data to support this, never having been refuted yet that I'm aware of in no paper has it found contrary evidence finding that it is not a disease of metabolism of the brain in the brain. It's not been refuted yet. And so this should be the theory that should have been continued to be propped up in order for it to continually be criticized, I should add. It's not that it makes it bulletproof. The bigger a theory gets, the more it should be able to be toppled over. Then every brick that's being thrown at it, if it's not knocking it down, well, then it strengthens it appropriately. It's a stronger theory now. If the brick we're throwing doesn't knock the tower down, it is become incorporated into the structure and it's stronger. There have been that little tower of the plaque-based theory of Alzheimer's has been knocked over so many times. It fit the narrative that they wanted, whoever they were. It was easier to develop drugs that would address plaques than it has been to just tell people, help your brain become more insulin sensitive and give it some ketones from time to time, and very likely your brain's going to be just fine.
You don't need to invoke some enormous conspiracy of people who consciously came up with those things and deliberately lied about it. Like I'm sure, as you know, the way that these things work is just, if you and I both get our PhD and get similar jobs in similar research centers studying this kind of issue, if I come at it from the perspective of, well, I think there's this obscure little chemical in the brain that causes Alzheimer, and we need to spend $18 million to study how this thing grows, and that's what causes Alzheimer's, and we need to figure out how to get a drug that inhibits this mechanism, so therefore will fix that issue. This is a highly promising line of research because of the way that the drug patent system works, which is essentially a form of government monopoly. It makes a lot of sense to just find some symptom anywhere and find some chemical that can be shown in a trial to reduce those symptoms. And this is what modern medicine becomes, because you set up the incentives in a certain way where you have to demonstrate to one monopoly government agency, one mechanism that they choose. You set these as the goalposts. And so then you have billions of dollars of pharmaceutical companies out there shooting for those goalposts, hiring people specifically to shoot for those goalposts. We need to conduct a trial to find a disease and find the symptoms, and then find the chemical that we can patent and make sure that it's artificial. It has to be artificial, because if it's not artificial, you can't patent it. So it has to be an artificial chemical that can cause some significant effect on that symptom. So because if we do that and we spend about $1 billion in 10 years putting it through trials, and then we get the approval, then that's a money printing ticket forever, because then all doctors are required to prescribe it as a standard of care for this condition. And that's just going to mean endless yachts and vacation homes for everybody involved with our pharmaceutical company. So instead of having a free market system where ideas and drugs are tested by free agencies that publish their findings, you have a top-down system where the government just dictates, all right, this is the standard of care, everybody needs to take it, everybody needs to follow it. And, you know, as a doctor, you could lose your license if you don't follow those things. On the one hand, I'm proposing this kind of theory that would fit into this pattern that could lead to that drug eventually, which could make billions. You, on the other hand, you've come up with the conclusion that, hey, maybe I have this novel theory that if we get people to start eating less garbage, we could improve their Alzheimer's. All right, well, you know, you could make a good Instagram health influencer account out of that. You could run a small business that holds people accountable and helps them and makes meal planning. There are a few small businesses on that. Nothing like the drugs that you could run if you know, with my theory. You know, my theory that says it's a bunch of it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and we just need that. And that's exactly what they did with psychiatry, that other big scam, which also incidentally is massively affected by insulin resistance, but also nobody mentions it because, again, it's much more profitable. No, it's a chemical thing in your brain, and we just add a little pill. And then
and that was all refuted recently too. I mean, you're perfect to point that one out, where for so long we'd said it's a serotonin imbalance. And then now this big meta-analysis comes out and says, oh, well, actually it's not at all. And that's never been supported in the science. And it challenges, I mean, the most common psychiatric medication for these sorts of things is these serotonin regulating drugs that do nothing to benefit the person.
That's very true. And of course, the mechanism I discussed in the fiat standard, because of the way that financing works, is, look, mistakes happen everywhere. But fiat money and fiat financing of science makes it so that mistakes can never get corrected. Because once you identify this kind of mechanism, all right, it's the chemical imbalance of the brain, or it's the platelets that cause the Alzheimer's, or it's saturated fat that is causing the heart disease. Once you've set the mechanism so that getting government funding depends on formulating your hypothesis to be congruent with that starting point, once that becomes the everybody knows in the field, once that becomes the thing that everybody mentions in the first page of that scientific paper as a sort of starting foundation, then that's it. Then that's never questioned, never tested, never researched, and just
it is the lens through which it's all viewed.
Exactly. And then there's the only way that you can get called the scientist is if you use that lens. If you don't use that lens, you're a crank.
Yep. You're a heretic. That's right.
Yeah.
And exactly. I've been accused of that myself for challenging conventional views on obesity and disease. It just sort of it becomes too threatening, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think you know, to go bring everything back to Bitcoin, and this podcast is one big giant advertisement for why Bitcoin fixes everything. Is, I think, again, all of it is because of the fact that without a free market, bad ideas don't die. They just continue to get money printing. You need to wait for the money printer to die for that to get fixed. But Bitcoin is our way out. Bitcoin is a way for people to fund research that they want. It's a way for scientists to become financially independent so that they don't always need all these new extra research grants because their money is constantly inflating. I think, you know, the future, Michael Saylor talks about this. People will endow foundations with Bitcoin, and then that will be a much more effective way to continue to do their research independent of the fiat monster.
Well, that has to happen. Yeah, but now at some point, for science to continue to thrive in what has been such a bedrock of the United States having so many advantages, it was this system that encouraged and rewarded academic free thinking and these efforts to experiment and find the best ideas. Let the best ideas rise to the top. The more we prop up the worst ideas, because we have money that's allowing it to be propped up, we don't allow them to get filtered. It's I mean, it's the death of science, which is a very sobering. Not that sounds almost self-aggrandizing, where it's scientists, it's these philosopher kings, and it should be these deep thinkers who are the leaders. No, but the more we refuse to allow truth and reality, and even even in the reality of letting the market show what ideas have value, then the more we're artificially propping up bad ideas that lead just to our detriment and destruction.
Absolutely. And one thing I also wanted to ask you about is statins. What are your thoughts on statins?
Oh my gosh. So in fact, I would encourage, what a wonderful question. I literally just published a paper with 2 other scientists on this topic of the efficacy of statins for its traditional use. And anyone could just go to, I hate to promote PubMed or Google Scholar, but if you just type in Bikman and look for any papers published in 2022, you'll find it. I think we paid the extra fee to make it open access, which is something I always do, but it's like $6,000, $7,000 for my lab to publish a paper, so it's not behind a paywall. That's how convinced I am that these ideas need to have free access, that people need to get them. Anyway, I think statins are probably the most overprescribed drug. And my justification, so everyone knows statins are the most common drug used for heart disease. And we base its use entirely on someone's LDL cholesterol levels. That a physician will say, a clinician will say, okay, patient, your LDL levels are too high. You need to go on a statin to reduce your LDL levels. And while statins are effective at lowering LDL, they are tremendously ineffective at lowering the risk of heart disease, especially if a person, there's different scenarios, but if a person has never had a heart attack, but they have a high LDL and they're prescribed a statin, it shows no benefit at preventing that heart attack. If someone has had a heart attack and they're given a statin, it appears to be that there's a slight reduction in risk, but only in some people. You have to give a statin to like 20 people in order for one to get a benefit. So this is my view on statins, based on all of the best data that I've seen. LDL cholesterol doesn't matter at all. It's a totally useless marker of heart disease. Indeed, LDL cholesterol is a predictor of longevity. If you want to live long, we have the Baltimore longitudinal study, the Honolulu aging study, the Shanghai aging study. Multiple studies across the world have found that the longest lived people who have the lowest risk of dementia, the lowest risk of cancer, have the highest LDL levels. What a bloody paradox we've created by waging war on LDL. LDL is such an essential molecule of life. It's relevant for hormone production, moving cholesterol around. It's relevant for immunity. It literally can bind pathogens and remove them from the body through the liver to be cleansed from the blood. And so that's why the more we wage war on LDL, the sicker overall a person's going to get. But what I would say, if anyone listening is curious about statins, and of course, I'm not giving any medical advice per se, just insight, don't rely on your LDL level. You go and pay $70 or whatever and get what's called a coronary artery calcium scan, a CAC scan. You lay under a little CT scanner, it zips around you, and it actually measures the calcification in your carotid arteries on your heart. I have to say this because the evidence is so convincing. If someone has a CAC score of, I think, above 1,000, I think it was, or something like that, then it showed a mortality difference in taking a statin, regardless of LDL. LDL levels had nothing to do with it. High or low, it didn't matter. But if someone had really high LDL, but they had a CAC score in the low hundreds, I think it was, the statin had no benefit whatsoever. And because statins have such significant consequences, like lowering sex hormone production, lowering vitamin D, damaging the mitochondria, making your muscles ache, and these are real consequences that people need to balance. Every drug has a consequence. It's just, is the consequence you want worth the consequences you don't want? That's something we always have to ask ourselves as we put these unnatural chemicals in our body. But if someone has a high CAC score, then it appears that there could be a longevity, a mortality benefit to a statin. But if your LDL is through the roof, but your CAC score is 0, I wouldn't touch it.
Yeah. I think the statins were the most profitable drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. They may have been overtaken recently by an unmentionable, which I will not mention because don't want to get canceled from all social media. But it has been enormously profitable to focus on this one little metric and take a pill for it, rather than the very blatantly obvious alternative hypothesis, which is that it is the insulin that you should focus on.
And I should just add, though, lest it sound like I'm giving a tacit great pass to statins, there are so many different types of statins that people's genetics will metabolize the statins differently. So even if this were me giving advice to my dad for a loved one, I would say, don't do anything until you've gotten a CAC score. Okay, let's say he had a very, very high CAC score, lots of calcification in the carotid arteries. Then next thing I would do is say, get what's called a pharmacogenomics test. These are typically $200 or so. Some insurances actually pay for it here in the US, but it is our genes will dictate how we respond to medications. And it's very possible that the person gets on a statin that they metabolize too rapidly and it doesn't do anything, or it has some adverse effect. The third leading cause of death in the United States is adverse drug events, for goodness sakes. And that is the third leading cause of death. It's heart disease, cancer, and then adverse drug events. And part of this is because you're prescribed a drug that doesn't get metabolized well in your body. People naturally have different genes that are involved in the processes of clearing molecules, particularly in the liver. That's where most drugs get metabolized and eliminated from the body once they've kind of lived their life. But some people either metabolize them too quickly, so it doesn't do any good, or they metabolize them too slowly and the chemical's sticking around much longer than it should. So there are a lot of caveats when it comes to statins. Should you be using it based on the very limited data available at all? And then second, you need to make sure you metabolize it well. But Saif, to your point, even if someone has known calcification in their arteries, there was a cardiologist by the name of William Davis. He published a book on this, and he quantified reversing calcification in the carotid arteries strictly through diet in his patients. So typically they will say once a plaque in the blood vessel has calcified, then it's like a stone and it's not going anywhere. That is the prevailing idea to this day. Well, this cardiologist, Bill Davis, he's published reports quantifying the reduction in calcification in patients strictly through adopting the dietary changes that we've been talking about.
Yeah. All right. Daniel's got a question for you. Daniel?
Yeah. Hey, guys.
Hey,
Benjamin. Nice to meet you. Brilliant,
hey, brother.
Brilliant pod. Thank you. Yeah, it's just been really, really interesting. I got to represent the Bitcoin plebs and ask you a bit of. You probably see the bro science that gets thrown around in the Bitcoin Twitter realm. So, well, first of all, it's brilliant that your lab is self-funded. Do you accept Bitcoin? So, if anybody listening to Safe's pod can send you some donations to keep you independent.
You guys, that is so. I appreciate that so much. One of the tragedies of being at a private institution is I can't accept direct donations. Everything I do comes through the university on what's called a sponsored research agreement. But you guys, I've gotten enough requests for this kind of thing that I'm thinking about creating a nonprofit. I just don't know how to do that. Like something that could accept donation and then just pay for the equipment and pay for the students that are doing my work. So at the moment, I hate to say this, but no, I don't.
Well, someone listening will have an answer for you. I'm sure someone will reach out.
Honest to goodness, I would welcome it enormously, because it has gotten a little challenging in that regard.
The bro science questions. There's a lot of chat on Bitcoin Twitter about seed oils. And
yeah. Well, no, I'm glad you're bringing that up, because that was something we didn't get around to. So my theory on what is the worst thing, how our diet has changed, is that it is now consists of fake carbohydrates or processed carbs and processed oils. And the processed carbohydrates, Saif and I have, I think, really beat that to death really well, which is this is what's spiking your insulin, and chronically elevated insulin drives a resistance to insulin. But on the other hand, the processed oils like seed oils, they are also problematic, particularly at the fat cell. And that's relevant because that's where I believe insulin resistance begins. It is the first domino to fall, if you will. And when the primary fatty acid in seed oils is a fat called linoleic acid. And anyone who's been diving into the seed oils already knows that fat. Linoleic acid is problematic because as it accumulates in the fat cell, it gets metabolized through a process called peroxidation into a molecule called 4-HNE. That's, of course, the abbreviated form of a much longer name. But 4-HNE, as it accumulates in fat cells, it forces fat cells to grow through a process called hypertrophy, where the fat cell itself is being expanded and getting fatter and fatter and fatter. That is not how all people get fat. Some people can get fat through a process called hyperplasia. And this was something Peter and I just were chatting very briefly about when Saif went to help with his baby at the very beginning. But if a person's physiology allows their fat tissue to grow through hyperplasia, which is when the fat cells stay small, but we multiply them, that is the person who paradoxically can get fat but stay metabolically healthy. Their blood pressure is okay. They don't have infertility. They don't have insulin. They don't have diabetes. Their glucose levels are normal. That is the vast minority of people. Most people get fat through hypertrophy, where the fat cell gets really fat, if you will, and it becomes insulin resistant to try to prevent further growth, and it becomes pro-inflammatory, literally secreting molecules that turn on inflammation throughout the body, all in an effort to try to increase blood flow through all these swollen fat cells. Anyway, to answer the question and bring it full circle, that's what seed oils contribute to. Among other things, seed oils do more, but what I focus on as a metabolic scientist is what they do to the fat cell, and seed oils will force hypertrophy of the fat cell, which becomes a very insulin-resistant, pro-inflammatory fat cell, which starts having that first domino tip into the other in promoting the insulin resistance throughout the body. So while we didn't beat that topic to death, I'm thrilled you brought it up because there's no question it's relevant. So I consider seed oils to be a secondary cause of insulin resistance because directly they're not going to do it on the body. They have an insulin resistant effect as it alters the growth of fat cells in a unique way, in a uniquely harmful way.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think?
Go ahead, Saif.
Do you think there's merit to the idea that you look at traditional populations? A lot of them did eat carbohydrates. Now, obviously, it was nowhere near as much carbohydrates as we eat now,
Yeah,
and it was
not as
nowhere near
refined.
and not as refined exactly
That's
as
right.
what we eat right now. But some people point to that as saying that the issue is not the carbohydrates; the issue is the.
I
seed
know they
oils.
do. I know they
And
do.
if you get rid of the seed oils,
But I don't know how they can say that because they're creating they're making up the scenario where, because as we just noted, these same, like the Kitavans, they would eat a tuberous vegetable, but it was roasted and, or steamed or something. They're eating that whole thing. And absolutely, their insulin would have come up and come down. The thing that people don't want to note in those same Kitavans is that their fasting insulin was like 2 microunits per mil, a fantastically low insulin. And my problem, again, the reason I focus on the carbs, not to necessarily overlook the seed oils, is that it's the refined starches consumed so frequently that result in this never-ending insulin spike. And so leading to a steady increase, and we know this in people, that their fasting insulin levels will get higher. Even fasting insulin will get higher and higher and higher the more they're eating processed carbohydrates to the level that we are. So the people who are saying, well, these traditional cultures ate tuberous vegetables and they didn't have seed oils, so it's not the carbs that are the problem, clearly it's the seed oils. I say, well, you've created this false protection around the carbohydrates when my idea is that it's what's spiking the insulin too much. And if we were all just eating a boiled potato once a day, similar to the Kitavans, we would have no problem. So the seed oil advocates, I think in some instances I think they've gone too far. Now they would say, well, screw you, Ben, you're ignoring the seed oil data. I'm not. In fact, I literally do experiments with linoleic acid in my lab. I'm just thinking we have to make sure we're talking about the whole story here. And if someone only eliminated seed oils, but they continued to eat sugar all day long in the form of gummy bears and things, there's no question too much insulin causes insulin resistance. That's been well documented. I would say there's more evidence. I can't frame it that way. There's absolutely more evidence over the past decades showing that elevated insulin causes insulin resistance than there is showing that seed oils cause insulin resistance. So I just can't ignore that. Now, I'm not ignoring the data on seed oils and linoleic acid. It is absolutely there. And so I want to give it its proper due, but those who espouse that idea I think they've gone too far.
No, I agree with you. I think the examples that are mentioned, and sometimes they'll say, well, Irish people ate a lot of potatoes during and they weren't overweight. And I think, of course, there is some truth to that. If you're not getting fat, if you're not eating a lot of dietary fat, then yeah, you can get away with more carbohydrates. But also, the carbohydrates before the 20th century are just a completely different animal.
They are completely different. Yeah, that's right. And but even still, my main rule, that first principle, was control carbohydrates. Don't get them from a bag or a box with a barcode. And so whole fruits and vegetables, they generally have such a modest insulin effect, especially vegetables, compared to the tropical fruits like bananas, pineapples, mangoes. But like you said, Saif, we've changed those over the past 100 years. Apples, for example, around the world, apples used to be small and bitter little things. And we've bred them to become these big sugar bombs. And so this is happening around the world. So it becomes an easy critique of the kind of carbohydrate insulin-based view of insulin resistance. I find it somewhat galling, just because these now we've just been criticizing science, but I literally create insulin resistance in cells in my lab across the hallway. And linoleic acid can do this based on its effects on the fat cell. But elevated insulin does as well, and that happens through chronic consumption of refined starches.
Yeah, and I think in the Fiat Standard, I cite this book called Bright Line Eating by an author called Susan Thompson. She does a very interesting comparison, looking at sugar and flour in particular. And she says, if you look at what has happened with sugar and flour in the 20th century, thanks to industrialization, it's very similar to what has happened with cocaine and heroin. Basically, opium and the coca leaves are things that had existed among human society for thousands of years. And, in Peru and Bolivia and many of those places, it's a common cultural thing that is, particularly if you have work. So like a worker who wants to put in a whole day of work and they want energy, you chew some coca leaves, you get a little bit of energy and you use it. So this is what it was. And for hundreds and thousands of years, this is what it was like. And then you get to the 20th century where you get to modern technology. Modern hydrocarbon energy allows us to process things so much more efficiently and powerfully and cheaply. And then you start taking these coca leaves, essentially you would take what it would take the average worker maybe a week to chew through, and then you process it and you condense it into a tiny little refined white substance that people can snort very quickly. So you can consume, and the same is true with heroin and opium. So you because of modern processing, you're able to get it in a highly palatable form. You don't have to spend time chewing in order to get to the essence of it. You get the essence straight away, and that's what makes it so enormously addictive and destructive. And she says that's exactly the same thing that has happened with sugar and flour. It used to be extremely expensive and difficult to process sugar and flour and to be able to consume them. It's difficult to grow plants that have sugar because they get eaten by pests and other plants. And even if you do manage to grow them, you grow a little bit, and then there's a limit to how much sugar you can get. You need to chew through a lot of apple and swallow a lot of indigestible matter in order to get a tiny little bit of a sugar hit. But then the 20th century comes along, and now we've got white sugar being sold for practically nothing at a supermarket.
Or we have pure apple juice, where we've removed all the chewable stuff, and now it's just pure fructose and water. It's toxic. We didn't talk about juice, but as a parent, I consider that to be one of the great travesties of what parents are unwittingly doing to their children. Children should be drinking nothing but whole milk and water. No juice. Fruit juice is a horrific, just sugar. It's like you're giving them soda pop.
No, absolutely. It's terrible. And and I see this a lot in like the health influencer circles. Obviously, there's a lot. I think you want to color. You want to have a little bit of skepticism about one kind of financial interest that exists in this industry. Obviously, it's nowhere near as corrupt and bankrupt as the scientific establishment. But within the bro science circles, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. It's not all perfect. There is, of course, the slight bias wherein you get to be more popular as an influencer if you tell people they can consume more things.
Indulge.
You know? Indulge. If
we
you
want,
found,
yep. It's
Yeah,
human
if you-
nature to want validation in a destructive behavior.
yes, and also, you know, if you tell people that no, you can have this sugar and you can have that treat and you can have that and you'll be fine. Obviously, it's going to sell better than the, you know, the party pooper who's just going to tell you no, you shouldn't have any of that stuff. And like okay, fine, I sympathize with people. The people are addicted. Everybody has their addictions, but like realistically, you see how this colors people's analysis. So something like that, like you eliminate seed oils and then carbs stop being a problem. And so you see a lot of this kind of people who are, you know, just sugar junkies and looking to justify their sugar junkies, saying, oh, just take out the seed oils and then you can keep eating all the sugar that you want. No, it doesn't work that way.
No,
I mean,
it
you
doesn't.
can. Well, I mean, obviously you can. I'm not your mom. You could do whatever you want.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but don't expect it to yield these great returns.
It's and it's obviously much better than eating garbage, but realistically, it's not as good as just not eating any of the sugar at all.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Peter has a couple of questions too.
So sorry, Peter. Before we move,
go ahead.
I had one more bro science question, Saif, and it's entirely up to you. You will leave this into your podcast or not.
I think I know what this
You
is.
already know where I'm going with this. Ben, I heard you talk briefly about testosterone earlier in the show. There's a big movement in the Bitcoin space where the plebs like to sun their balls. What's your take?
Are you serious?
I
I mean, is this a euphemism? Or you mean like actually get out there and hang your sack in the sun?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, there's even special poses for it. But you know,
oh my gosh,
this is a real thing. And the idea behind the bro science is that it stimulates, you know, the testosterone in your body. So I don't know if you've experimented this in the lab, but you know.
Yeah, that'd be hard to get IRB approval for. Yeah, so,
well, that's what Bitcoin research is for. Let's fund it with Bitcoin.
I know.
This is what the
create an
bro
offsite.
There's no IRB in
lab.
Bitcoin. If you get the coins, you can spend them as you want.
Oh, that's how it used to be, you guys. That's how it used to be. I look at the work of what scientists did in the field of starvation and feeding about 80 years ago, before the era of IACUCs and IRBs that limit what you can do. Oh my gosh, they were able to get away with so much glorious work. So anyway, Daniel, I have never seen any paper published on this. Now, to truly kind of think through the system, I can't help but wonder how that mechanism. So I'm thinking through the mechanism, and maybe someone would say, so cholesterol is, honestly, I can't fathom what the mechanism would be.
The mechanism is that sunshine is obviously great for your skin. I mean, try and hide from the sun for 6 months. It's going to be bad for your skin.
I get that. So sunlight.
Sometimes scientists can overcomplicate things, Ben.
Well, no, I know.
Sunshine.
But let me come back even. Yeah. So, I mean, sunlight does convert cholesterol into vitamin D. So like, I'm thinking, what is the process whereby cholesterol, which is the basis of all sex hormones come from cholesterol, which is why when you wage war on cholesterol, like through a statin, libido plummets in men because you're destroying their sex hormone production because you're getting rid of the building block. So if sunlight converts cholesterol to vitamin D, I'm unaware of any effect where sunlight converts cholesterol to sex hormones. But so I challenge that a little bit. And I'm very familiar with that biochemical pathway. I teach lectures on this topic. But I also think evolutionarily, if we needed sunlight to have our testes promote more vitamin D, they'd be on the top of our head. Not literally tucked in the darkest spot on our body if we were walking around naked. Now, that sounds silly, but I hope we can all kind of see that there's some wisdom to that. If nature or God,
counterpoint, Ben.
Yeah.
If they didn't need sunshine, they would be inside your body.
Well, no, that's temperature. But that's a good counter. But that's a temperature phenomenon where sperm, if it gets produced at a higher body temperature, it's dead, basically. It has to be a little cooler. But I think that if our creation story were such that we needed sun exposure on our gonads, on our testes to get enough vitamin D, they would be on our back or on our shoulder. They wouldn't be tucked in the darkest part of the body. So I don't believe that it makes any difference.
All right. Well, just to finish up my question then, if you do manage to get that funding, I think this is going to be the thing that people want to fund you to look into.
You know what, though? You guys, if there is any truth to this, And honestly, it would be very easy to make these experiments. I would say that will give birth to a little device that has a UV lamp, and you just simply tuck it between your drawers. They do?
Yeah.
Oh my
Well,
gosh.
no, not portable
Not
devices.
specifically for that. Not, yeah, exactly. No, but
Well,
It's regular
but there's
tanning
not-
devices.
Yeah.
Well, that would be the way to do it. You just have a small little device and you just crook it in your crotch, and then you're producing testosterone like gangbusters. But you guys, in all sincerity, are there reports of people who have only done this independent of any other therapy? Like they didn't go low carb and go carnivore, which can increase testosterone. They didn't start working out more, which can also increase testosterone. Are you guys familiar? Is there anything that has removed all the confounding variables and said, I literally did nothing but put my sack in the sun and I had higher testosterone levels?
I believe the respected Bitcoin Twitter scientific authority that is Fartface 2000 has conducted such an experiment. And Fartface 2000 is one of my really paragons of truth in Bitcoin.
Okay,
Twitter.
I met joking. This is a real
I'm not
person.
joking. I met him. I've met him before. He's been to a couple of my dinners.
Guys,
He's a
what
great
have I
guy.
gotten? What have I gotten involved with here, you guys?
And he's
Yeah.
a great guy. He works in I forget his exact job. He works in construction. I think he's got a really successful job somewhere in New Jersey. Like just a hardworking, very smart guy who's just gotten into Bitcoin at some point, and he's like
Challenging dogma.
yeah, and he'll just
Oh, I love
take
it.
anything and follow it and do it. And he was
Well-
posting all of his stuff. He's like in his 50s, I think, and he was
You guys,
doing this
let
stuff,
me
and he
let
got
me
the
just
UV
say,
lamp, and I think he
You did it.
reports great results.
well, I'll look them up. But you guys, in all, one very relevant variable here, as much as we fellas who want to be virile and strong and tough focus on testosterone, the levels of testosterone in a man can vary widely, and it has no predictive power with his lean mass or his muscle mass. What is a more predictive variable is the concentration of testosterone receptors on muscle and bone. So it's not just how much testosterone you have, but how well it's working where you want it to work. And that is something that is very affected by exercise. You go out and exercise and you will increase androgen receptor levels on muscle, almost immediately, and it'll stay up. So as much as we focus on testosterone levels, and they matter to some degree, a normal group of men will have levels that can vary almost by 10 times, and it will have nothing to do with how muscled or ripped and virile they are. So I just, that's kind of a little bit of a counter to this idea, but it's certainly compelling.
Yeah, I mean, this is I'll just add one small thing, which is like my intuition is to just follow the fart faces of the world rather than worry about the mechanism. Because the way that science advances is that people try things and then they work and then they discover the mechanism. So
but even still, let's say he's exposing himself to the sun. I can't help but say, well, he's just making more vitamin D, and vitamin D is immune boosting. It is muscle. It was bone mass protecting.
I guess so. You want to control.
I would just say there's a confounding variable here that you just can't eliminate.
I think what you would want to do is get the same amount of sun exposure, but only difference being that you would cover that area between two groups of people. Shouldn't be too difficult to organize this voluntarily on Twitter.
Well, it sounds like there's a whole group of people who are lining up to be volunteers. I never would have imagined.
I know. I think we should do the control group and
yeah.
All right. Well, Peter's been
Daniel. That's awesome, dude. Thanks.
I was happy to give away that very important point of order on Bolton. So my question was about the reversibility of insulin resistance. So we've talked a lot about all the things that can cause it in terms of lifestyle, but if someone has already entered, say, the pre-diabetes stage, are they able to reverse through lifestyle changes? Could they reverse their insulin levels down to, say, the levels that you're talking about in the Katavans, or are they kind of beyond a point of no return at some point?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They can turn it around. In fact, the reversal of insulin resistance by adopting, this has been well documented there are multiple case studies published on this, so I can speak to it with confidence. You have people who are so insulin resistant that they're on multiple medications, like insulin, taking metformin and other anti-diabetic drugs. All you can do is start having them engage in fasting and low carb diet. And within just weeks, they have to get off all of their medications because they've corrected the problem so quickly. And so everyone who is either on the earliest stages where they just notice they're a little chubby and they have high blood pressure, or they're full on type 2 diabetic, which is like the most obvious form of insulin resistance going down the road, that can be turned around literally in weeks. And a person can start to lower their insulin in just the same day that they decide, I'm going to fast for the next 24 hours and just drink water and have maybe some salt to help my fast be a little easier. Their insulin levels will come down by several, not orders, but it'll go half, then third, then a quarter of it. It'll come down very, very quickly. And like I said, within just months, weeks to months, they're as insulin sensitive as a marathon runner. So yes, very reversible. It is the good news. The gospel of metabolic research is that if you use diet to cure the problem, then you've cured it. But the food we eat is the culprit or the cure. And when we acknowledge the relevance of food as the cause, then we acknowledge that it also can be the cure.
Okay. So just one follow-up question then. So in terms of the damage that insulin resistance does, if you're saying that it can be totally reversed, then how is the damage done? Is the damage done cumulatively over time? And then when you get to a certain point, you can't reverse the Alzheimer's, you can't reverse the condition that you've generated?
Yes, what a great question. Unfortunately, I can't give a universal answer to that because it would be tissue specific. Let's take, for example, the muscle. When muscle becomes insulin resistant, insulin can't defend muscle protein as well. And you start to have a higher rate of what's called catabolism, or just a breakdown of the muscle protein, which increases what's a situation called sarcopenia. A person just has muscles that are getting wasted away. That's part of insulin resistance. You can correct that the moment the muscle becomes insulin sensitive. Then muscle protein gets defended and you've corrected the muscle wasting. The same would go at the liver. Fatty liver disease is the most common liver problem in the world. And it is largely a result, at least partly, of chronically elevated insulin stimulating fat production in the liver. Well, you start to lower the insulin and the fat starts to clear itself out. So those are totally reversible. The brain appears to be somewhat unique, where its pathology towards dementia is such that I cannot say that insulin resistance is the only relevant variable. Because as you start to correct insulin resistance in the body of someone with Alzheimer's, yes, it does improve the Alzheimer's, but it does not fully reverse it. So that either means there is a point of no return with the insulin resistance, that maybe a part of the brain has starved enough that it's now dead and cannot be resurrected, or it suggests that there is another variable that we just haven't identified yet. We know it's not plaques because that appears to have nothing to do with it, but it does suggest that there's it could be a difference. One of the other theories of Alzheimer's or contributors is iron metabolism. And it could, in fact, Saif, I know you had, what's his name? Mangum. Yeah. He's a big iron guy, for example. So he's a good one I could refer people to. But we know, although I don't think he talks about iron in Alzheimer's, but we know that iron can accumulate and disrupt the what's called a redox balance and oxidative stress in the brain. So that's an additional input that might not get addressed in some people. And that's somewhat of a genetic component, as well as, eating supplemented foods with iron, which we all do. If it comes in a bag or a box with a barcode, it's got some kind of iron supplemented into it, rather than the heme iron that you get from, say, beef. But anyway, yeah, so some problems which aren't entirely a result of insulin resistance, and Alzheimer's might be that, aren't going to be totally reversible. That's maybe the safest way of saying it.
Who else has got questions? Andre?
Yeah, I just thought that on the planning and discussion we had previously, if it could be possible that the skin on your body that has not been exposed to the sun at all, maybe it can absorb more vitamin D than the more sun.
That absolutely. The darker the complexion, the harder it is to have the UV light convert the cholesterol into vitamin D, which is why in general, the fairer the complexion, I'm a pasty white guy. I would make a lot more vitamin D. Say if you have a darker complexion than me, kind of Middle Eastern complexion, you would need more sun. Like the vitamin D that I'd make in 5 minutes, you would need maybe 20. So Andre, absolutely. But that is, again, a confounding variable to this study that would make it difficult. Are they feeling better just because there's more testosterone? But again, testosterone level is only part of the variable. It's testosterone receptor concentration. But yeah, it could be that you're making more vitamin D because that's such a fairly complected skin. By fair, I mean like lighter complected, that you can just make more vitamin D with a given given UV exposure per time.
Hi, this was a very great conversation. So my question is also one bro science about sunscreen. Shall we use it, or is it better to go natural?
Yeah. So I'm uniquely qualified to answer that question because I sunburn so readily. You ask that question to someone else and they say, I never need sunscreen. And they don't. They literally don't get burned. I burn. Now, I know a lot of people say just don't eat seed oils and you won't sunburn anymore. That is just not true. That is just not true. Some skin complexions just burn. So I would rather get a sunburn than put sunscreen on my body. No question. I don't even have to think about it. But I don't like to get sunburned. So I will just kind of dose my sun exposure. If I'm out at a beach or at a pool or whatever with the kids, I will absolutely strip down to my swim shorts, and I will get some sun for a good chunk of time. And when I feel like I'm reaching a limit, I'll put on a shirt and just put on a hat and continue to enjoy the sun. I will not put sunscreen on. There are so many chemicals in that get readily absorbed into the bloodstream. I would rather get a sunburn than have sunscreen on my body. Now, if you're putting on like a zinc oxide kind of, but then you look all pasty white and weird, but even still, I want some sun exposure, especially on the trunk of my body. I want to make vitamin D. I want to set my circadian rhythms such that my melatonin knows when to be suppressed and it knows when to turn on. There are so many benefits to sun exposure that the more you're blocking this sun effect, the more you're undoing a really health boost. And unfortunately, because we live under fake light in buildings all day long with UV protection on our windows, we never are getting sunlight. So I think people ought to make a point, even if you're justifying the sun exposure by saying that your testes need some sunlight, then whatever, sunlight is just a good thing. But I'm very opposed to sunscreen.
Can I just follow up also about the sun? Because there's a lot of attack on the sun. So would you comment that sunlight makes you older, that if you are avoiding sun, that you will look younger in the older age? And also, if you sunburn more, will you have a higher risk of cancer?
Yeah. Good question. So everybody know, please, I'm answering these questions with a little bit of speculation. I'm a metabolic mitochondria guy. These are topics that I'm familiar with, but I'm not an authority on them. But I have enough familiarity to have an opinion. So with sun, it does appear that the more someone is getting blistering sunburns, the more they will develop skin cancer. Yeah. Now, getting a little pink, no, I don't see that there's never been correlation, but these are all correlational studies, which I have a great deal of disdain for. And I'm sure this is a group who appreciates causal studies compared to correlational studies. All of this is correlational, where they just happen to see people who are getting blistering sunburns will tend to have more skin cancer. But there are a lot of different types of skin cancer, and you can have people with very dark complexions who don't get any sunburns ever, and yet they can still get skin cancers because there's just so many different types. And then, Dorian, what was the other question? Sunburn and cancer, and then what was the first one?
Yeah, so the people who are attacking the sunlight, they are saying that
aging.
if you are, aging.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, I don't buy that really. What I do know is that the higher someone's glucose levels are, allow me to kind of hijack that question and bring it back to something I do know. Whether sun can cause wrinkles, I don't know. I've never seen a study on that. But I do know that high levels of glucose will create what's called, we call it a Maillard reaction that can happen on the skin. You guys know a Maillard reaction is what happens when you char something. Like when Saif wants some beef, he puts it in his sous vide machine, and then no one wants to eat the meat right out of the sous vide. You go sear it. In that kind of crisp seared, that's what's called a Maillard reaction. And a part of that is what's happening. It happens less on the meat, but it can happen on vegetables from taking glucose molecules and then converting them due to the heat. or in this case, due to the sun exposure. So when someone is getting a lot of Maillard reactions, that can in fact cause wrinkled skin. And so I would say it's less sun, and it would be more, what are your glucose levels?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience is that you will burn if you're not exposed to sunlight a lot. So if you've spent the winter in North America and you fly to Mexico in March and then spend a week in the sun, you will burn, and it could get ugly. It could be very bad. But if you gradually introduce your son to sunlight, if you make sure that even during the winter you get exposed to as much sun as you can, and then if you don't up the dose of sunlight at once, then your body will just grow into it, and it'll be able to handle more and more sun. So I could spend hours in the sunlight, and I don't. But again, who knows? I could be wrong. It could be harming me in certain ways. So who knows? All right. Anybody else have any more questions? We've gone for, well, it's been 2 hours and 15 minutes almost. But anyone have any more questions, Ben? Oh, yeah.
I've just got a quick one, Ben, on your take. It's back to the insulin management, an old supplement been around forever called berberine.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so, in fact, I hate to push anyone to Instagram. I found that I initially was on Twitter. I also started doing more kind of little lessons on Instagram. And I did one about berberine just because there's so much curiosity about it. Berberine absolutely works. There is abundant peer-reviewed, placebo-controlled, double-blinded clinical studies, which is the best we can get, assuming that everyone's honest with it, that absolutely show that berberine does improve insulin sensitivity. And it does so by activating this little enzyme called AMPK, which the moment AMPK is activated, which berberine turns on, it will stimulate it'll stimulate sugar burning. So lowering blood sugars, lowering insulin, overall improving insulin sensitivity. So if someone were to go to their physician and the physician said, you have prediabetes, I want to put you on a drug called metformin. Metformin actually works through a very similar mechanism to berberine. I would say, not that I'm giving anyone clinical advice, of course, I would say, you know what, maybe try the berberine first, because yes, it will have a more modest effect than metformin will, but it also doesn't have the kind of gut-wrenching side effects that metformin has. Literally gut-wrenching.
I gave up sugar about 6 months ago, which was kind of painful, but opted to start taking 500 milligrams of berberine and noticed a dramatic. I mean, it's just,
you know, like, what? Good for you.
For a while was tricky, you know, as far as you kind of have this lethargic kind of. I don't know, you described it earlier, and as you're trying to get away from the sugars and just burning your fats, if you will. But now it's just like normalized. And, you know, if you're going to go out and do a heavy, like wood cutting day, which I do a lot of, maybe I don't take berberine that day.
You know what also you should try, if you are monitoring your blood sugars at all, everyone could do this. It works remarkably well. Add a little bit of raw unfiltered apple cider vinegar into your club soda or a cup of water. It's remarkable. These little, it's part of the lessons.
Actually doing that
good for you. Good for you.
And it's just all together. I just was curious on what you're really in depth with a lot of this stuff. And, you know, I'm just more or less triangulating what I've picked up in other places. I think a big proponent is David Sinclair, an aging guy, has really guided down that line.
Yeah, so David Sinclair is more of a biohacker than I'm comfortable with. He loves to promote a certain number of supplements.
He's also from Harvard, so he's out there to sell a lot of proprietary stuff.
Well, the fact he is a bit of a shill. Yep. Yeah. So I've really started to lose respect for him. Anyone like him who tells people to take these drugs, like metformin is a drug he tells people to take. And I think what an asinine piece of advice to suppose that this foreign man-made substance is somehow going to help you live longer, and we know in humans metformin works by damaging mitochondria, albeit slightly. But this is why you show that people who undergo aerobic exercise, which I never do, I only do resistance training for best bang for the buck, but people who undergo aerobic exercise will have bigger, stronger mitochondria. But when they take metformin, it undoes all of the mitochondrial adaptations to that exercise. It puts you back to baseline. And I don't know how someone could justify taking a drug where we all say, everyone would agree, Exercise is a key to living a longer, healthier life. Oh, but also take this drug. The fact that it will undo the benefits of exercise, well, that's just an inconvenient truth. I want to be popular. And so if I promote all these clever biohacking substances, people are going to adore me for it. I think he's just gone too far.
Yeah, and also it's all of the same climate hysteria nonsense, and you shouldn't eat meat, and you should eat, this magic little grape that if you have 3 grapes in the morning, then
Yep, that's right. That's why I said the thing about superfoods. Everyone says all these superfoods, it's this molecule in grapes, and no, I mean, it's so silly. It's just so silly to think that humans evolved to need these kinds of silly little things when our ancestors would have never eaten grapes. They ate meat.
I mean, the vast majority of humans have had zero exposure to the vast majority of plants for all their lives. Like the vast majority of things that you see in your supermarket were only ever available to your ancestors.
We had to breed them. We had to breed them in a way to reduce the toxins and enhance what can be digestible and give us energy. We have in our clever technological era have created plants from plants that would have been inedible in a previous generation.
Thank you so much for all of this. This has been absolutely amazing.
This was my pleasure.
I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all your work. Thank you for really just focusing the flashlight of truth on the thing that matters. Like, just stop eating garbage, you get healthy. And then, let the fiat people argue about their papers forever and their mechanisms and all these weird acronyms. But the most important thing people need to know is just don't eat garbage. That's
while they're struggling getting papers peer reviewed, I'll be out sharing truth. Yeah,
I'll be out eating steak and sharing truth.
Yeah, that's right.
and thriving, basically. Yeah. So thank you so much, Ben.
My pleasure. This was great, guys. Thanks so much.
Cheers.